Bom dia a todos e todas.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Professor Ivan Furegato.
A transmissão tá muda.
You're muted in the
Tá
transmission.
na transmissão, pode ficar
The
tranquilo.
transmission. Okay.
Oi?
Okay.
Posso ir, Simão?
Can I go, Simon?
Pode ir, Ivan.
Bom dia a todos e
Good
todas.
morning, everybody. My name is Professor Ivan Furegato, and I welcome all the participants in our seminar, and I thank the availability of the participants and the mediators to be with us today here in this important event. This seminar is being held by the Laboratory of Management of Physical Education of the University of São Paulo, in a partnership with Abragesp and Bell Sports. We count with the support from OSIS Production and CAPES Financed. We make use of the opportunity to thank our partners who made it possible for the holding of this event. So I leave my thanks on behalf of the whole organization of the seminar. And let's start the activity of the international seminar Afro trainers in football, and I give the floor to Professor Ricoco, leader of Ethical, to make the official opening of this event. Good morning, Ari. Good morning, Ivan. Good morning, everybody. My name is Professor Ari Rocco, here the leader of the Lagicon, as Ivan said. So let's start the activities of the international seminar. Afro trainers in football. A seminar was organized by the Laboratory of Management, Politics, Marketing, and Communication in Sports of Physical Education of the University of São Paulo, LAGECON, and is happening remotely. Its objective is to promote a debate about Afro-Brazilian trainers in football, considering the research about a topic that has been carried out in Brazil and the United States. We make this opportunity to thank you all for the participation, and special thanks to the professionals, the researchers who will be here presenting their research works and reporting their professional experience. So a good event to all of us. Thank you, Professor Oriroco, for the initial words for our event. And really starting today's program, I call as the mediator of the sequence of activity, Professor Douglas Veronico, researcher, PhD researcher of the Unifest. Good morning, Douglas. You have the floor. Feel free to start. And I'm going to remember that Douglas is going to mediate the research about representativity of trainer, coaches, and players in Brazil and in England. So he's going to mediate this initial moment of this event. So good morning, Douglas. You have the floor. Good morning, everybody. The presentation research about the representativity of players in Brazil and in England will be done by Professor Douglas Long, a PhD student of Lagicon with a period in the Stirling University in Scotland, and guest researcher at the Manchester University in England. He's also the coordinator of the teamwork of diversity, equity, and inclusion in sports management of the Abragesp. So I let you know that your questions or doubts can be sent during the presentation written using the chat function, and it will be related to the lecture to be answered at the end of the first part of the seminar. We let you know that at the end of the presentation, we will have a link for the roll call form to be filled out by the participant. Professor Douglas, good morning, everybody. Good morning, Professor Douglas. It is a satisfaction to be here with you. Professor Ari, our leader at the Lagicon, Professor Ivan, my colleagues and partners from England, Dominic, who's going to participate shortly, Delroy, and Marcelo Carvalho here in Brazil too. We would like to thank, on behalf of Professor Ari, the whole team from Lagicon Abragesp for the partnership of being able to, given this partnership, we are transmitting by the Abragesp YouTube channel. My partner and friend Renato, on behalf of OSIS Productions, to the organizing committee, that we together we've been working in the last months to make this event possible, and to the participants who are with us here. As Douglas said, I spent some time in the United Kingdom, met Don, Leroy, went there to study, and when we came back, we had the idea of holding this seminar. I'm going to share a presentation here. Let me see if I can do it. Yeah, well, I can do it. Let's see how long it is going to take me to do it. Very well, then. Sharing. And there I go here.
Acho que apareceu aí, né?
I believe that you can all see it, okay?
O nome da apresentação é pesquisa sobre
the name of the presentation is research about the representativity of coaches and players in Brazil and in England. We'd like to thank my guide and professors, Professor Flávia Bastos and Professor Claudio Rocha.
Eu vou me apresentar rapidamente.
I'm going to introduce myself quickly. I am graduated in physical education. I believe that it's important to give you some context. I graduated at the Santa Cecilia University. I am professor of physical education. And what I like to comment about my training is that I graduated in the beginning of the center. I finished my graduation in 2005. And the topic of my thesis for end of course was the Brazilian player at the Brazilian football. A history of discrimination. I've studied that, and right after that, I am managing partner of a company called Abel Sports, what's the name of my father, and then we'll comment about that. We are consultants in stimulated projects, etc. And I am a sports manager. I am a leader of a sports organization, of a educational sports program of the Santa Pot Foundation. I believe there are people from the foundation here, team. So I'm sending you a big hug. So it's been there as the leader for 16 years. We have an educational sports program at the Santos area, Santos and Guarujá, with some sports. I specialized in project management by the Pontifical University, Catholic University in São Paulo, and then I did a master's at EAGE at the University of São Paulo East Campus, and there I studied public policies, which was the law of stimulation of sports incentives. At the time of my master's, 2018, I started to go to the studies group of JEPI, led by Professor Flávia, that then became my guide and professor. So in 2018, I started going to Logicon, and then at that time, I associated myself to Abragesp. So I became a member, partner of Abragesp, and today, as Professor Douglas commented in my description, I am the coordinator of the theme work group in diversity, equity, and inclusion in sports management at Abragesp. And then we'll comment a little bit more about that. Then I went to physical education. Then I went to IFE. The master's was at GPP, Management of Public Policies at East Campus. And then I came to the School of Physical Education for my doctoral PhD thesis that I started in 2022. Now in 2024, I did a sandwich period, the first semester at the Sterling University, sponsored by CAPES. So I got a scholarship from CAPES. So I'd like to thank once again to CAPES, the Brazilian government. And at that period, I became, at the end of my period there, I became a guest researcher at the Manchester Metropolitan University, in which I exchanged many conversations and experiences with Don, who's here. And I started my PhD studies, as I said, in May 2022. When I started it, the point of research that was approved here at the EFE was how racism influences Afro-Brazilian managers to perform leading positions in sports organizations. I say that master's, I normally say, is a half marathon, and that PhD is a marathon. To run a marathon, I need something that inspires me, to motivate me, that really touches me. Then I decided that I was going to leave the research in public policies, and I brought the point of the ethnic or racial relations, racism, that I had studied 15 years before in my graduate studies. I knew that I wanted to study about management, about sports, leadership positions that I have as a leader, and sports organizations. So when I started, you can see that because of the research topics very broad, which sports manager, which leading position, which sports organization. That's how I started. And then in Google, at the first moment, I put in Google, leader position in sports organization. And also in English, leadership, sports organization, sports management. And then, what appeared to me? Started seeing lots about Afro-descendant coaches and this underrepresentation, black coaches and underrepresentation. From that moment on, I geared my research, the leadership positions I changed to black coaches, sports organizations to Brazilian teams, and from there, 6 months after starting my PhD studies, in December, so to speak, my topic was like this. It was this: how racism influences the representativity of black coaches at the top level of the Brazilian football. I talked to my guiding professor. We talked and we decided that we would follow this path. So from that moment on, with this the first initial reading, 3 topics ended up really touching me. When you talk about coaches, black coaches in the Brazilian football, I remember this person here, Mr. Abel. Mr. Abel played at the greatest football team of all time. Is it really? Yes, it is. Look who he is playing with, Mr. Abel, next to Pelé. I went to Scotland and said, oh, Mr. Abel played with Pelé. And people say, wow, he played in the Brazilian team. He didn't go to the 1966 World Cup because he got hurt. And when he finished his career, he became a coach in Qatar. And he went to Qatar's worst team, Qatar, in the 1980s. It was 2 divisions. The championship was organized, the football was organized there, and he went to the worst team of the 2nd division. His team was so bad that he had the opposite goalie kicked the ball and scored a goal. And then after 2 years, there he is raising the trophy, and they were the champions. They could get to the 1st division, the 3rd league, the best league, and they played the top position in the Qatar Cup with the main teams. And here he is in the most recent years. Mr. Abel is my father. So when I started studying and seeing this, many images and feelings and memories of my childhood or my teen years came to my mind, because I did not understand how my father, a coach, that's me as a child or a teenager, how can a coach who was selected the best coach of the year in Qatar, amongst the many other top coaches, when he came back, there had no opportunity at the top team here in Brazil, 0 opportunities. Meanwhile, others
tiveram oportunidades, grandes clubes, até em seleção brasileira.
Even to the Brazilian team, and not taking the merit from the other coach. This ended up affecting our family a lot, because it's a bit of what I am today. Many ups and downs in our family. So that was the first feeling I had when I saw that I'm going to study black coaches. The second one I had was the following. In this first reading I had, I realized that when we talk about the representativity of coaches,
os pesquisadores do mundo, daqui a pouco o Dom vai
The
mostrar,
researchers of Don and Del are going to show in English. They compared the representation of the populations of coaches with the population of players.
aqui eu estou mostrando
Here I'm showing a table from one of the main researchers of diversity and sports management, who's George Cunningham from the United States. Here is the chart he shows
do beisebol profissional, do
from
basquete
professional baseball, professional
do
basketball,
americano profissional, do
professional American football, university football, and it shows how many black players, how many black assistant coaches, and how many black head coaches. NBA, 87.7% of the players are black. Assistant coaches, 45.7%, and head coaches, 30%. This comparison of the representation of the population of coaches and players, you prove the sub-representation. So that was the first thing. The second item that I checked, that I saw, that I identified myself with. First, the involvement I was going to have with the research, that I lived with a black coach my whole life. And second, how the sub-representation is proven. And the third item is that, I'm going to show it later in the next table, that in Brazil, there is little academic production and gaps, theoretical and methodological gaps about the topic. We almost do not study about racism and what refers to coaches or leadership positions. There are almost no researches about that. But it's this very same Brazil which does not study, does not investigate about the topic of representation, of black racism interfering in the leadership position. It is the Brazil of Zumbi, from Palmares, of Dandara. It is Brazil of a very strong black movement, which has brought us here. There is still racial inequality, enormous racial inequality in Brazil, but we had progress. Racism is a crime in Brazil thanks to the black movement. And today we have quotas, affirmative actions at the public universities. The quotas have led to the creation of hetero-identification commission. What are the commission? There have been many frauds in the candidates that were going to fill out the quota position. We started having many frauds, and then the universities have created hetero-identification commissions to check the color, the race of the candidate. So, putting it together, I, when participating in a study group of the movement at Abragesp, seeing that there was no data in Brazil about the representation of the players. It was from there that we thought about creating the methodology of hetero-identification and do the research to get the data that I needed. See, my point of research is how does racism influence the representation of black coaches in the top tier, the Brazilian football. So to talk about representation of black coaches, I needed data. So there comes the first critical reflection to the managers of our Brazilian organizations. Here in Brazil, we don't have one piece of data. Now we do. But we do not have data about the representation. How can we create measures without data? We need to put the research with the measure. That's how quotas were created, affirmative actions. In a certain moment, we saw that university, we didn't have blacks. But there's this many percent of black. And then we created affirmative action, and then we needed data. In Brazilian sports organizations, we do not know. We do not know how many women. How can we talk about equity and diversity and inclusion in a sports organization if we don't have that data? This is the first point. And then we created this methodology. That's a commission of hetero-identification formed by 4 judges
leva em consideração a diversidade
that takes into account diversity, judges, men, women, black and white, that with racial knowledge, or lay people without any knowledge, they would get the picture. I went to the Brazilian Confederation website, got to the pictures, I saw who were the assistants and head coaches of those teams. They would get the pictures individually without contact among them, and they would follow black, Indian, yellow, or pardo. That all of that would, together with Professor Douglas participated with that, together that we were using a spreadsheet, and then we had 3 judges in agreement in the choice of a color or race. There were 3 out of 4. That color or race would be defined for that individual. And then we got to the data of the size of the representation of the players, of the coaches, and of the assistants of the Brazilian football championship that I'm going to show now in the video. I asked Renato to put the video. Last year, we had a video telling the story, and I'll repeat the video now. Renato, go.
A gente vai, estamos aqui online, as coisas, às vezes, dependemos da internet e tal, mas o vídeo vai sair. Será que o vídeo vem? Aliás, eu nem estou pegando meu tempo aqui, nem sei. Como é que eu estou de tempo aí, Douglas? Douglas?
São 9h11 agora.
O
It's
vídeo tá
9/11 now.
Tá rolando na internet.
Ah, não estava vendo. Me avisa quando acabar.
São 9h11, acho que você tem até 9h35, né?
Beleza.
Foi composta por 1.062 jogadores, 20 treinadores e 45 auxiliares técnicos. Nós criamos comissões de juízes, os quais heteroidentificaram, de forma individual e sem contato entre eles, as cores e raças desses sujeitos, que foram as mesmas utilizadas pelo IBGE, ou seja, branco, preto, pardo, amarelo e indígena. Vamos aos resultados. Dos 1.062 jogadores, 53,3% são negros, ou seja, pretos ou pardos. 31,7% são jogadores brancos, 0,2% são amarelos e 0,3% indígenas. E para o restante dos jogadores, não houve concordância entre os juízes, ou seja, o resultado foi inconclusivo.
So now we will show the results of Brazilian players. Among them, 57% were classified as black, that is, or mixed race or black. So 29% were considered white, and 0.2% Asian, and the same result, okay, from the and the remainder was inconclusive. So this first analysis, we could observe that Black people would represent the majority of the players within the Brazilian league. So let's see the results now of the main head coaches. So 90% of them were classified as white, and 10% were classified as inconclusive. That is, there's no agreement between the moderators. So what we can observe in this data is that we couldn't see any identification of Black coaches in Brazil's elite soccer. So among them, 68.9% were classified as white, and 17.8% as Black, and 0% Asian, 0% indigenous. So among the assistant coaches, we saw that there are Black people, but in a smaller number in what really happens in Brazilian society as a whole. Another analysis, we can see that inequality here in football is bigger than actually in other aspects of the country. According to IBGE, 84.4% of leadership positions are occupied by white people, and 14.6% occupied by Black people. As in football, we could see that 90% is occupied by Black people, and there are no Blacks as head coaches. So beyond that, we can see that underrepresentation of Black head coaches here in Brazil is actually bigger than its peers in the professional leagues in the United States and among Black players and Black coaches in European football. And to finalize that, we'd like to say the importance of the quantification, the ethnic racial scope of all the members of the technical committee, players and coaches, to adapt the underrepresentation, to combat underrepresentation, and help them get leadership position. All this data from this research is an article that was submitted to an international magazine and is going to be available soon.
Ok.
Okay.
Então,
So now we can see that this is the data from the Brazilian Championship from 2023. This video is on my Instagram if you want to watch it again. The article hasn't been published yet. We submitted it, but there was and we decided to submit to another magazine, but it's under approval. So I'd like to highlight the importance of having this data to quantify them. That's what I bring to the Brazilian organizations. So we need a bold gathering of data here. Okay, CBF, the Brazilian Olympic Committee, we need a major gathering of data of the representativeness in sports organizations. How many Black people, how many whites, how many women are actually taking positions in these organizations? This is the first step. Well,
fiz a de 2023 só da
so
Série A.
I think I did with 2023, starting from the first league. So we did it in 2024 now. We got back and did the first and second league. And then I take advantage of this moment to actually to launch here this report that I'm going to share now. Just to see, let's see, Renato, if I have to stop here or put it straight. I think it went straight. Yes, is that so, Renato? Yes. Can you see it?
Tá sim.
Ok.
The
A
other, the
subrepresentatividade
underrepresentation of Black coaches in Brazil's football elite. So we did a head identification of players, coaches, and assistant coaches of the first and second leagues in men's national championships. Okay, so as a part of this report, myself, Professor Douglas, and our mentors, Professor Rogério, Professor Claudio, who is going to moderate the next panel, and this is my tutor and my co-tutor, and also Flavia from my tutor here from the São Paulo University. So here we start by having an introduction here, And then, by the way, here I inspired myself to do this report based on the reports that are going to be shown by Delroy from Black Footballers Partnership. They produced two reports there in England with data from about the representativeness in their country, and inspired by that, and also a conversation I had with Donald. It would be interesting for you to create a report. So we produced this report. It has 6 sessions. The first section describes the methodology, and then it reviews the data. Okay, so the data here from the first and second league. So the 57.9% of the players and from series first and second league were deemed Black or mixed race, and there's 60.86% were classified as
Desculpa. Quando considera
sorry. So when you consider only the Brazilian players, removing all the foreign players, when you take into account only the Brazilian ones, is only 60.86% of players are foreign. And then I compare it with the IBGE data, as I did in our study from 2023, and I talked about the representativeness of the coaches. I showed the data about the coaches, and here let's go quickly here. The methodology, section 1, and then the players' data. Okay, so we have white, Asian, indigenous, Black, all players, 27.7%, mixed heritage, 23.2%, and Black and mixed heritage, that we didn't deem it as inconclusive. Okay, we just put like Black/mixed heritage. That's what we say in Brazil. We consider Black as Black people and mixed heritage people. Okay, so you can add that up. So all players combined 57.9%. So when you consider only Brazilians, we can see that 60.9% of players, the Brazilian players, are Black. So when we compare the players with the Brazilian population, we can verify that according to the IBGD data from 2022, we can see the white men and women, 29.1.
Segundo o IBGE, 42.8%.
According to 42.8, actually 42.8 are white, and players are 29%. Mixed heritage of Brazilian population, 45%, and 24.7 among players. And say like actually Black citizen, they had to identify them as almost 30% of players. It's almost like 3 times the players comparing to the Brazilian population, 3 times more. That shows that the players could actually break this barrier of becoming a player, but then when they become a leader, when they go into management, we see there's as to head coaches and assistant coaches. Head coaches. This is like the main coaches. Okay, 12.5% Blacks. Okay, identified in the Brazilian football. I'm talking about 40. I'm talking about 40 players. There was like 3 mixed race and 3 Black/mixed race. Not a single one entirely Black. As to assistant coaches, we can see some slightly higher representativeness. 19.3% were identified as Black. And here, as we had seen in the Cunningham research and in the previous slides, when you compare the population and the representativeness, the ethnic racial scope, and you compare it to the coaches and the assistant coaches, and then you can actually see the size of this underrepresentation. In 2023, we can see that 0% was identified as Black. Now, there's a percentage of 12.5%, still highly, very underrepresented. When we break that comparative study that I did in 2023 with a black coach with the black manager in leadership positions, you can see this here. And our conclusion here is this report is available and on the side of Bell Sports. This is the research team, Donald, our tutors here, and how to cite the report in case you want to use it. Okay, this is there's a very fresh, very recent study bringing some data to our national sport. And now the other research, the other that I did was in the United Kingdom, in England. So then, rather different from here. There they have data. They had this data. When I was there, I took this methodology, the same methodology of heteroidentification, the very same methodology. I created committees of moderators, of arbitrators. I got all the players from the Premier League sides. I logged on team by team and checking who the head coaches were and the assistant coaches. And then they had to identify themselves. And here are the results. Premier League, season 23-24. So there was 47% of all players were identified as white, and then 32% as black. If you combine black and mixed heritage, which is our Brazilian for pardo, the black slash mixed heritage, we have 32% of black players. And that is not very different from what Elroy is going to present here. There's this, let's see the side of inconclusive here, when there is no agreement among the arbitrators, when somebody writes a mixed heritage, somebody writes white, somebody writes black, it's 12% in England. Among head coaches, we can see 85% were identified as white, 5% as black, and 10% as inconclusive. When we have a look at assistant coaches, we can see 90% as white, 5% as black, and 5% inconclusive. And now, Professor Douglas, for myself, just to finalize here, I bring the Brazilian national championship, the first league, and the Premier League, 23 in the season 23-24, 2023-2024. Here we have the two tables. Okay, the black population in Brazil here, 56.7, and in Premier League, 39% of coaches in Premier League, 5%. And in Brazil, this year, only Premier League, 15% in Brazil. That 12% that I showed the report is having the second and the first league combined. So this is like a portrait of what, at the moment I did the research. So we know that the coaches, they are fired. They are made redundant, they are hired halfway through the championship. At that very moment, 15% of the head coaches of Brazilian First League were identified as black, and in Premier League, 5%. So when we say there's assistant coaches, 14% in Brazil of black people, black assistant coaches, and in England, 5%. We're going to see how underrepresented one is and the other. We can see our tutors, Professor Claudio and Flavia and Don, who is in England. It's in our programming to write an article about these cases, and we'll compare theories and bring theories actually to reflect upon these championship. Professor Douglas, I'd like to thank you. I thank you in English. Here is my information. So, Professor Douglas, let's move on to the questions and the answers. I'll stop sharing now.
Olá,
Hello.
muito boa apresentação.
That's a very good presentation, excellent presentation. And let's go over the questions here. There is a question here to begin with, made by Gerson Lima, and in which he says, it's important to understand colorism. It says a person is like a little less black, the person is not, what if the person is like mixed heritage? Is this going to be a change in the classifications? I read the book, very good question. I read a book, the name of the author escapes me now. It's called, it's a collection that is led by Jamila Ribeiro, researcher. One of the books talks about colorism and the discrimination that the pitch black black people, the mixed heritage people, and there's some data. There's some data I wanted to show. So when you see like the black players, we see that almost 30% of them they were classified as black, almost 3 times as than in compared to the Brazilian population. When I talk about head coaches, when I bring this 12.5% number, I'm adding up mixed race and black. But if it's only black people, none was considered actually like black, like totally black. So we have to remember this is not a matter of research. I needed those data to move on with my thesis. My thesis is, how does racism influence the representativeness of black coaches, and then considering mixed race in Brazil's football elite? So I'm going to interview such coaches from the first and second league and assistant coaches from both leagues. And then I intend with these interviews to have this analysis and taking into account colorism that was mentioned here. So sensational. Actually, I was struck by some curiosity here. Could you mention, within this matter of colorism, examples of black players in Brazil that they were like Abel, your father, but do you remember other black coaches that didn't have like an opportunity or have very little opportunity in Brazil? So we can contextualize that for everybody, even the foreigners who are following us. So, and during my readings here, I will present in the next panel a systematic revision that I identified just like the state of the art. So what was researched around the world in Brazil and around the world in any sport, okay? So in my study called State of Art, I could identify over the 90 articles. I read pretty much all of them when I was in Scotland. So I have an analysis, an understanding of what the researchers brought to me. Why did I go to the United Kingdom, to Scotland, and also England with them? Because when we did football, when we studied football, that's where they study the theme the most in the world. That's what's going to be seen in the next panel. But then, why am I saying this? Because within these studies, we can see what are the barriers that can be identified. Dom is going to talk about this, and I will also research here. What are the barriers that make underrepresentation happens? And there are several themes connected to this theme, several studies connected to it. So how does discrimination happen? Discrimination in terms of access, to access a position. What happens when they are fired? What's the next opportunity they have? So we can remember Andrade here by Flamengo. In Flamengo, is a victorious coach who, after that, fell into oblivion and they had no more opportunities. Is a champion head coach. So that's what they has to do what they identified there. It's a coach that has some sort of discrimination that affects the opportunities and experience of other trainers, other coaches. I bring George Cunningham here. We have to make an analysis, a holistic analysis. We have to take into consideration the opportunities, the experiences of such coaches in the macro level and also in the macro and minimum, in a big lens and a small lens. Great. So maybe Marcelo can also, when he talks, to confirm and provide more examples. There is Lula Pereira. There are some cases. Now you may continue. Now you can go on. But what comes to my mind is DD, world champion, to contextualize that for the people who are following us internationally. There is a strong case, and he was like a world champion in 58, and then a coach in Peru's national team in the 1970. If I'm not wrong, he became a coach in Brazil, but he didn't have the same sort of projection as he had as a player. I will now move on to the commentary from Rodrigo Serafino. Good morning, everybody. Even inside the pitch, the goalkeeper position had more positions for black athletes in recent years. It's a highly responsible position. I can talk about this, goalkeepers. Before we go here, you can see Donald Douglas. So it's not any similarity is not just a coincidence. We are brothers. And as a coincidence, we study the theme of racism in soccer. So within these lectures, these readings that I did, what is one thing that appeared a lot was like, what is the barrier, the stereotype of the leading position? So then we're going to see like the organizational teams, the head coaches, the main leaders, the person who gets the biggest spotlight and gets the highest salary. We can see that the guy who was a player, who is a coach, a head coach, he was a player, the 90%. I'm talking about the elite here, right? The top tier. So what do several studies bring? What can we talk about that, Professor Douglas? And you can comment. What I read about coaches, they commented that the desegregation that the black athlete suffers since he was a player. There's called racial stacking. And then when they move, from a player to head coach, this stereotype that the one is the guy who's got like physical power, not so much stamina, not so much intellect. It extrapolates for the leader outside of the pitch, who is the head coach, and then it continues. This discrimination continues. So yes, there is a connection between your study and my study, Professor Douglas, because that's why we did this study together. Your study is about the racial segregation in football, and surely you will take advantage of our data and everything we did within these researches. So talking about the positions here, we can also talk about an underrepresentation. There are like studies about this, especially in the United States. There are studies in American soccer, American football, and so on, the underrepresentation of Black players in specific positions that are highly characterized, highly connected by leadership and organization, a tactic organization, and an overrepresentation of players or athletes in positions that are characterized more for physical strength and stamina and so on. So to talk quickly, like there are studies in soccer and in England and in Germany, so that we are actually promoting here in Brazil. But in connection to the goalkeeper, we maybe Marcelo is going to talk about this better. But there was a problem in the World Cup, 1950 World Cup, where Barbosa, the goalkeeper, was so called they want to be blamed for Brazil to lose that World Cup in Brazil. So mainly this goalkeeper Barbosa was like the culprit, and this has perpetuated for a long time. And only recently, as Rodrigo Serafim said, there's been recently only a change now where we can find, for example, a black goalkeeper from a Botafogo. We have one now also. So if I'm not mistaken, unfortunately, we're short of time. We have only 1 minute. Professor Donald, would you like to comment something? Would you like to see if there is another question that can be answered? Would you like to wrap it up saying something? Well, we have a lot. I'd like to say that we have a lot to move forward within this subject. We have a research done by Ethos Institute now in last September, showing the leadership positions occupied. We're talking about the representation out of Brazil's 1,100 top companies in Brazil. In sports organization, we don't have such data in Brazil to talk about diversity, inclusion, and equanimity, equality in Brazil. So we bring this contribution here about specifically talking about the head coaches, and then and that's when I was in England, in Scotland, in the United Kingdom, I came with this feeling that this subject is not really discussed. It's something that people sort of take for granted. So it's something that that gives me like a sort of stomach ache, and I feel bad, I feel sick when I see things on social media. When there is like a meeting from a major club, a major team in Brazil, and there are only white people. So then we can say, who is going to be the next head coach? And they are always white. So I came with this feeling that we should shed light on this. And that's why we've organized this seminar. And I'm sure that Dom will contribute in the panel greatly, and I'd like to thank people whoever wants to read the report. We can provide the link here, abelsport.com.br. Kisses and hugs, as we say in Brazil, and thank you, Professor. So we had a few more questions, but there was no time. And then I'm going to pass on to you some other questions from Luis Sergio. Okay. All right. Now I'm going to give the floor to Professor Ivan.
Now I'm giving the floor to Professor Ivan. I'm going to finish this stage. Thank you, Douglas. It is important discussions, topics brought by Donald. Now we're going to have a quick break, so we'll continue our event. So we'll be back soon.
de volta então com o
We're
seminário.
back now with a seminar, Black Coaches in Football. I once again thank the sponsors, the supporters of the event, in addition to the participants, and to everyone who's following us via YouTube, either in the transmission in Portuguese or in the one in English. And continuing the program from today, I introduce the mediator of our next roundtable, Professor Dr. Claudio Rocha. Professor Claudio Rocha is a professor at the University of Stirling and who will be the mediator of the roundtable that is going to cover sub-representation of Black coaches in football. Good morning, Professor Claudio. Welcome, and thank you for your participation. Feel free to mediate our next activity, the roundtable. Thank you. Good morning, Ivan. Good morning, everybody who's present. So we'll start a roundtable about the sub-representation of Black coaches in football. We informed that the presenter is going to make their speeches. Any doubts or questions will be covered in the session conclusions and reflections at the end of the event. We remember you that during this roundtable, we're going to have the link of the roll call to be filled out by the participants. So now I give the floor back to Professor Veronico, a PhD student with a Sandwich period at Stirling University in Scotland and researcher at the Manchester University. Then the floor is yours. Hello, hear me again? Thank you, Professor Claudio, Professor, and my guiding professor, who I have the honor of having you, and Professor Flavia, my pastors and my guide. I'm going to introduce here quickly, because I am talking to the others, but I'm quickly talk about the state of the art. What is the state of the art? What was I'm gonna share my presentation here. Share. And I'm going to open my presentation here, which is this one here. So once again, the presentation of the art of the sub-representation of Black coaches. I'm going to once again talk about, I am guided by Professor Flavia Bastos and Claudio, who's here, who is in the step here. And this event, thanks to the scholarship that I had from CAPES at University of Stirling, where I did a sandwich period. For those of you who are coming here, my first presentation quickly, I am the director, the partnering director of Abragesp Sports, together with my father, sports manager of the Santa Port Foundation, member of Logicon, Abragesp, and we'll talk about the Stirling University and Manchester University. As I commented, I got to know the state of the art and see what we have in research in the world. And then Professor Claudio came here with a systematic review to see what happened in the world about Black coaches in sport, about the sub-representation of Black coaches in sport. So the objective of the systematic review was to analyze and identify the academic status of the studies of racism and the sub-representation of Black coaches or minority, ethnic or racial minorities in Brazil and the world. So I was talking about all sports, modality could be any sports modality in Brazil, in the world. There was a systematic review done in June 2023, and we are updating, but what I'm going to bring here is the data that we got to that moment. What have we identified? What are the main topics studied about this topic? Well, first, impact of the affirmative actions in the promotion of equity and the racial representation. Then I mentioned Conrad Code, who's here with us. So Conrad Code is one of the researchers in the world who studies the impact of legislations or action, the effectiveness of those legislations, how effective they were to fight this representation. This is one of the topics. Other legislations we have, for example, in the United States, we have a running book on, is going to talk about that. Another topic that is access and barriers found by the coaches. There we have Bradbury, who was the guider for Protecton. He is one of the main investigators of this topic. When we're talking about football, if we're talking about sub-representation in football, Bradbury is one who's got more articles and publications, experiences and trajectories of those coaches. It is another topic. And the rotation, turnover of coaches in the positions. What happens? And then we'll talk about access discrimination, treatment discrimination, transfer of positions, trajectory. So those are the main topics that are studied about this topic in the world. We found 10 PhD theses, 3 master's dissertations, and 2 papers of end of course around the world. 5 books and 37 chapters of books about the most different topics: diversity and inclusion in sports organization, race, reform, and pursuit of equal opportunities for coaches. There were books about Britain, Asian, British people, exclusion in the industry of football, the culture of the Aborigines in Australia. Some of the books in several chapters. I commented in my previous presentation, we've identified 92 articles. Out of those 92 articles, 75% were from the United States, 9% from England, 5% from the United Kingdom, that involve in England. England is in the United Kingdom, to other areas of the United Kingdom, and 2% from Australia, and only 1 article out of those 92 in Brazil. That shows the lack of data we had in Brazil. Those from England, most of them about football. As I've commented before, that was the reason of my choice and look for researchers in England. The most studied modalities with more publicated American football, both professional and university football, our soccer, our football, and most of them in Europe, England, etc. I know US basketball and the professional and university basketball. So those are the modalities, the ones with most publications. The countries: United States, United Kingdom, Australia, Belgium. And what about Brazil? Where is Brazil in this context? In Brazil, there's little academic production and methodological and theoretical gaps. Very few data about representation and diversity in sports. And then, Professor Claudio, as I said, to be very fast, to listen to our international researchers, final considerations. The data obtained reveal how much the topics investigated in the world, how much we have to progress in this debate in Brazil. Given the precarious characteristics of the study in the country, due to the importance of obtaining knowledge of the topic. In practical terms, that knowledge may guide actions of the entities of the administration of football and sports within the federal and regional spheres and serve as support for the improvement of public policies to fight racism in sport in the country. Here we have the references and my contact information. Thank you very much, Professor Claudio. I give the floor back to you. I'll stop sharing here. Thank you very much for the presentation, Donald. Very interesting to know the literature as you brought to us. We remember that participants and the questions will be covered in the section conclusions and reflections at the end of the event. Please continue sending your questions at the YouTube chat box. So now, I would like to introduce to you Professor Dr. Dominic Carricold. He's a professor at the Metropolitan University of Manchester, Manchester Metropolitan University. Professor Dominic investigates racial inequality in sports leadership, as Donald said. He's been there for a while, and it's a great pleasure to have Dominic this morning or this afternoon in England with us. Dominic is going to make a presentation about the analysis of the effectiveness of the English laws to fight sub-representations of Black coaches in England.
Dominic, it's a great pleasure to have you with us, and the floor is yours.
Fantastic, thanks, Claudio. I'm assuming everyone can hear me okay. Just checking, yeah, good. Yeah, thanks very much for having me, everyone. I'm really happy to take part in what I think is a very important seminar that is shedding the spotlight on an issue that continues to sort of plague the sport that we all love. So I will share my screen. I have some slides to present, if that's okay. So I'll just quickly share that, and then I will get into our presentation. Do just let me know that you can see these okay when I put it in present mode. Can people see that okay? Should just see a PowerPoint slide. Is that okay?
It's okay. It's not in the presentation mode, but it's fine. We can see here.
Oh, let me try that again. Sorry. Apologies. Now is it in present mode?
No, I cannot see anything now, Dom.
Oh, let me try that again. Apologies. If I swap these screens around.
Our sport person here is saying, okay, go ahead.
How about now?
Oh, perfect. It's working fine.
Perfect. Great.
Yeah.
Fantastic. So I can't see any of you guys, but hopefully you can see this. So yes, I'd just like to say again, thanks for Donald putting this together and everyone else who's played a part in organising this seminar. As I said, this is a very important issue in football that clearly goes beyond my own research field, which is English professional football, as an issue in various parts of the world as well, as we can see from Donald's talk earlier as well. So welcome to my presentation. What I'm going to be discussing is the representation and experiences of racialised minority coaches in men's professional football in England, and particularly the effectiveness of measures designed to address racialised imbalances. So really an overview of the research that I've undertaken in this field for the past 6 or 7 years, starting during my PhD at Loughborough University. And yes, I will hopefully give you an insight into some of the research that's been undertaken in the English context and what the main issues are and how sort of the issues have progressed to examine not just the figures and the reasons for the figures, but also what's been done about it and what works and what doesn't work. Hopefully you'll see in the bottom left there my details. Just to remind you, I'm a lecturer in sport management at Manchester Metropolitan University in the UK. My email address is there in the bottom. If anyone has any questions I'd like to follow up with based on my talk, I'll be more than happy to speak to you to follow up on them. So yeah, feel free to send me anything that comes out of this. Just to give you a quick insight into what's coming up, I'll give a brief overview of my own research and my research with colleagues in this area, and I'll tell you a little bit more about myself and what I do currently. Then I will do a quick overview of the representation of racialised minority coaches in men's professional football in England, chiefly looking at representation and experiences. I won't go into the level of depth on figures and numbers of coaches that Darrow, I think, will be going into. So I'll leave space for Darrow's presentation, because I think he's got a lot more detailed analysis of figures and levels of coaches there. But I will just give a quick context to what I'll be discussing. Next, and this really has been the crux of my research over the past few years, is what actions have been taken by the football authorities in England to try and address the historic and continuing underrepresentation of racialised minority coaches in men's professional football in England. So the dial has shifted a little bit in the research context, academic context, from looking at not just what are the numbers, what are the reasons for them, but what's been done about it as well. And particularly, as point 4 says there, how effective have these actions been? Policies look fantastic when they're put out there, but as research often tells us, a policy document alone or an initiative alone doesn't necessarily mean it will create the outcomes it's intended to. So I'll go into a bit of detail there about key considerations when we are examining policies designed to address underrepresentation in sport, and specifically football. Then quick wrap up with some concluding thoughts based on my presentation and the research I've undertaken in this sphere over the past 7 years or so. And then I'll talk about some recommendations that I have written about in mine and my colleagues' publications in this area as well, things that have emerged from the research that I believe would make a significant difference in not necessarily introducing new measures, but tweaking the way that current measures are delivered. Because as I will argue later, I think there are a lot of merit to the initiatives that are going on. It's sort of the delivery and the framing of measures and the scaffolding around them, which can often sort of discredit and limit their effectiveness in this sphere as well. So again, just a brief introduction. Dr. Dominic Corncode, lecturer in sport management. My email is there. As I said, I'll be speaking about my research over the past 7 years or so. My research in this field began during my PhD, which was at Loughborough University. So my PhD examined the representation and experiences of racialised minority coaches in men's professional football in England. And as I said, also the effectiveness of measures designed to address these racialised imbalances. My supervisor at Loughborough was Dr. Stephen Bradbury, who was referred to in Donald's work, who is a leading academic in this field, and my PhD was really on the back of his research in this sphere. And Steve is someone who I continue to publish with in this area as well. Just a bit of a shameless plug. This is our most recent article about racialisation and stereotypes in men's professional football club youth academies in England, specifically looking at the youth level of the game, because various things at Donald, I believe, would have spoken about. I apologise, my Portuguese isn't fantastic, non-existent really. But some of those things will be discussed in this article that we recently had published as well. And really just setting the broader scene as well about where my research fits. There's really been a range of authors that have examined racialised inequalities in coaching and management in men's professional football in England over the past 20 years. These authors really have helped to place a spotlight on the underrepresentation of racialised minority coaches in the game and their experiences as well. So my research really owes a lot of debt to those authors before and what they have done to shed a spotlight, and also, in many cases, provoke and put pressure on authorities to do something about these continuing issues that we have in our game as well. You will know, I'll just make a point there, and I've said it a few times, my research is focused exclusively really on men's professional football in England. The women's game in England is something that has been looked at far less in academic research, looking around issues of racial inequality in coaching, leadership and management. There are some scholars who are starting to look at this, but admittedly that is quite far behind that area of work compared to the men's game. But I do believe in a few years there will be more data around the women's game and more insight into whether the issues that goes on in the men's game also are an issue in the women's game as well. But I just think it's important to know what specifically I'll be talking about and what I won't be talking about. I just want to bring up a point on terminology as well. So you will have seen that I've used the term racialized minority a few times. If you've done much reading in this sphere of research, you might see various different terms used in the English context, as Donald's work obviously hinted at. Brazilian context has its own terminology around different ethnic groups. When I use the term racialized minority in this presentation, what I'm referring to primarily are first, second, and third generation Black African, Black Caribbean, South Asian, and mixed ethnicity football coaches in England. More broadly than that, the term has historically been used to encompass indigenous peoples and historically settled and newer migrant populations of non-European heritage who are resident in countries in the global north, in which they make up a numerical and cultural minority. Another reason why I use this term and why I've used this term with my authors, co-authors and colleagues, is that adopting this term really acknowledges that race is a social construction, and that the racialization of people of color doesn't just happen. It's an ideological, definitional, and discursive process. So really hinting at the power dynamics behind this process of racialization. And really, that process of racialization of people of color has resulted in racialized minority groups having less power or representation compared to dominant white groups across a range of societal and, as we'll see throughout this talk, sporting contexts as well. So really, this term is intended to constitute a form of resistance to whiteness and the structures, cultures, and discourses of power which underpin its operation in practice as well. So just a bit of an insight into what that term refers to and why I have adopted it in the research and publications that I've done as well. So, as I said, I think it is important to discuss the background to all of this in the English context. So the representation of racialized minority coaches in men's professional football in England. The figures, and as I said, I think Deborah will go into a lot more detail about this, but just to give a broad brush overview of the kind of figures that are featured and underpin some of my research. So as we saw from Donald's presentation, racialized minority professional players in men's professional football in England constitute around 35%. I think it's historically, well, I say historically, over the past decade or so, hovered between 35 and 40%. My research has also looked at the youth academy. So that's players who don't play for the senior first team, but are younger and playing youth academy setups, which are more developmental focused in professional clubs. At that level, there's a slightly higher research. Our research suggests a slightly higher representation of racialized minority players at the youth academy level, around 40%. And then really the figure which has underpinned sort of 2 decades worth of research in this field has been this one, that racialized minority coaches at first team and youth academy level constitute around 4% of all coaches. So as Donald obviously spoke about, and as others will on the rest of the seminar, there is a large discrepancy between racialized minority players and racialized minority coaches, which really has been quite stagnant over a period of time. It's not like this figure came about overnight. This has been a very resistant figure in the sense that the dial has not really shifted much beyond 6 or 7% for that final figure about racialized minority coaches at first team and youth academy level. There are nuances within that I will make the point of, that youth academy specifically, there are more coaches from racialized minority backgrounds in youth academies. That figure is about 17%. So there are slight differences at the youth academy level. But another point of nuance that I do think it's important to make, that I will hint later on in this presentation, is that there is sort of levels of segregation in regards to the employment of racialized minority coaches in coaching positions across first team youth academy level. So not only do we find less racialized minority coaches at the first team level, which is considered the elite level of the game in England, but of those coaches who do work in youth academy levels, my research that I undertook as part of my PhD suggests that around 3/4 of those coaches hold lower status or part-time positions with more limited opportunities for occupational advancement. So really then not only are racialized minority coaches more likely to work at the youth academy level, which is generally more of a developmental arena in the game in terms of playing and coaching, but at this level, these coaches are more likely to work in lower status and part-time coaching positions as well. So there's sort of a double marginalization, if you will, in terms of where we are more likely to find racialized minority coaches in the game. Just think that is an important point to make, that there are nuances to these figures as well. The barriers, this is where my research in my PhD came in a little bit, again, building off work that some of these authors in the final bullet point here have produced over the past few years. So the barriers to speak about here, firstly, and these are just some of the barriers that these researchers have identified over the previous years, but these are quite prominent barriers that continue to have an effect on the employment opportunities and coach education opportunities for racialized minority coaches. So firstly, research has noted a continued operation and over-reliance on networks-based recruitment methods, and almost exclusive reliance really on these recruitment methods, which have been found to be premised on personal recommendation and patronage, and which historically and continue to militate against the appointment of racialized minority coaches who have traditionally been positioned outside of the dominant white social and cultural networks of the football industry. So the way that football coaches and managers have traditionally been recruited at the first team level in men's professional football in England is through these networks-based system, where it's more of a culture of who you know as opposed to what you know. And that has traditionally worked against racialized minority coaches who maybe lack or do not have the established personal and professional relationships that maybe white coaches have had and developed with key decision makers in club recruitment, such as chief executives and chairmen of clubs as well. Secondly, this body of work has noted the continuing existence of stereotypes and forms of racial bias in coaching workplaces and coach education contexts. So really here, to drill down into this, researchers noted the incidence of inferential racisms, some more subtle and nuanced and codified forms of racism, racialized microaggressions, and stereotypes and forms of othering, which has really underpinned the problematization, of racialized minority coaches as lacking the aptitude and intellect to excel in coach education and workplace settings as well. And these stereotypes continue to play a part in how racialized minority coaches are perceived in the game, particularly around their leadership skills and their ability to lead a group of players as well. Those stereotypes continue to be ingrained, research suggests. So there's some of the key barriers. And taken together, this practice and experience have been argued to be underscored by the sort of normative power of whiteness within the professional football industry, and really chimes strongly with research which has identified similar patterns of systemic access and treatment discrimination in other sports coaching contexts in the UK and beyond. Obviously, Donald referred to the US context a little bit in particular. A lot of these forms of access and treatment discrimination are found in other forms of US sports, in the major four sports leagues, and in other sport coaching contexts in the UK as well. Football has been the main place of focus for academia, but these are issues that don't only take place in football. There are other sports which have these same issues as well, maybe in slightly different ways, and they manifest in slightly different forms. But these key issues aren't specific to football, although football, perhaps, they are most magnified. And then, as I will go on to speak about at length, actions taken. So we've got the figures, we've got the reasons for these figures, and then the response of football authorities to these figures, which arguably has picked up pace a little bit in the past 5 to 10 years in regards to the general approach and philosophy of the actions taken to address these figures. What I'm going to talk about a little bit is two different forms of approaches that have been taken, two different sort of types of measure. Firstly, we have educative empowerment and resource support for racialized minority coaches. And then we've got the formalization and regulation of coach recruitment as well, which my research has focused on more significantly. I'll speak about that more at length. So, what actions have been taken to address the continuing underrepresentation of racialized minority coaches in the game? So, a range of football authorities in England have utilised a series of positive action measures to address the current state of affairs. I think, as Donald, I believe, referred to these known as the affirmative action measures in Brazil. Please, someone correct me if I'm wrong. I think the slight legal differences between positive action and affirmative action in the UK and Brazilian context. But hopefully, as I speak through some of these measures, it might maybe prompt some thought about how these measures could play out or be utilised in the Brazilian context as well. Just to give a bit of background where positive action measures come from, they're part of the UK Equality Act 2010, specifically sections 158 and 159 of the UK Equality Act. Now, these sections allow for employers to implement targeted practices of advertising and interviewing for vacancies in order to address patterns of underrepresentation on the basis of different protected characteristics, including ethnicity. So really, the underpinning philosophy of positive action is that it seeks to go beyond dominant liberal notions of equality, sameness, and equal treatment. So away from that idea that to create fairness and equality in society, we have to treat everyone the same. Positive action is more about enacting policy and practice which argue that for social justice to be achieved and for the redistribution of power and resources in society, there has to be a much stronger emphasis on recognition, difference, and equitable treatment. So noticing difference, noticing that people of different ethnicities in this instance do have different experiences in society, and we need to accept that and acknowledge that in order to try and address why those imbalances might be in place. Positive action in sport has not traditionally been used on a wide scale. There are small instances, and to its credit, although my research has often been quite critical of professional football authorities in this space, to its credit, football has been relatively novel and groundbreaking in its use of positive action compared to not just sport, but UK society more broadly. There's still a lot of contestation and debate around positive action, and it has traditionally been underutilized in practice in UK society and sport. So football, I must say, deserves some credit for engaging with these measures and these provisions in the Equality Act when other sports maybe have been less enthusiastic about doing so. Briefly here, for the most part, these positive action measures that football authorities have used have been what you can loosely call softer positive action measures, such as a provision of financial and mentoring support to racialized minority coaches, or opportunities to undertake extended placements at men's professional clubs and national teams. So for example, the men's national team setups, the different age groups up to the senior level. So the men's national team in England have utilised a scheme such as this that the FA implemented, where work placement, so there's been an embedding of a racialized minority coach in the coaching sides for the national team at different age groups. Jimmy Floyd Hasselbank, if anyone remembers that player, used to play for Chelsea. He was someone who took part in this scheme. We also had Chris Powell as well, as a former professional footballer in England. They're two examples of coaches that have taken part in these work placements. Other examples, as I hint at in the bottom right here with the listing of these different bodies, we have the Football Association, their Coach Inclusion and Diversity Programme. The English Premier League have their now expanded elite coach apprenticeship scheme known as ECAS. The FA and Professional Football Association, or the PFA, their national team placement scheme, which is what I referred to here, and the EPL, EFL, so the English Premier League, the English Football League, and the Professional Football Association have their Black, Asian, and minority ethnic player to coach scheme. As I said, together, these types of positive action measures, these softer positive action measures, have really been designed to support racialized minority coaches to enhance their vocational and experiential learning and their skill sets, with a view to heighten their employability within the football coaching marketplace. Now, the extent to which these processes of empowerment and development and sort of upskilling racialized minority coaches have enabled transitions into employment remains arguable, because, as I will argue a little bit more later on, these schemes are effective in enhancing the capacities and skill sets and experiences of racialized minority coaches. What these schemes don't do, these softer positive action measures, is fundamentally change something about how football recruits and gives jobs out. That bit doesn't factor into these softer positive action measures. So they're effective up to an extent, but as I argue, and will argue in the next few slides, what we really need to focus on at the same time is changing the way that recruitment takes place. And the way that racialized minority coaches are perceived in the game as well. That's important. We have to make structural and institutional change rather than solely these types of measures, which change something about the coach themselves. Arguably, these take a deficit perspective, which argue that racialized minority coaches are missing something, which is holding them back. But as I and my colleagues have argued, we should flip that around and say that the existing structures and cultures of the game are unequal, and that is a key factor which is holding racialized minority coaches back from a wider opportunities at coach employment. So other interventions, as I say, and there's less of these interventions admittedly, have utilised, again, quote unquote, harder positive action measures. Now, these have featured a much stronger focus on addressing institutional barriers of racial closure, which have been embedded in sort of run-of-the-mill, business as usual recruitment practices in professional club and youth academy settings. Now, again, I know Donald referred to this even with my very poor Portuguese. Interventions of this kind have been informed by the Rooney Rule, which is first implemented in the NFL, National Football League in the USA in 2002. Now, a key component of this rule is a strongly regulated principle of inclusive shortlisting for suitably qualified candidates from racialized minority backgrounds. So guaranteeing an interview for at least one racialized minority coach, providing they have the requisite qualifications. The rule is further supported, the Rooney Rule, this is, by a process of independent monitoring and the threat of significant financial penalties for non-compliance. And in the early days of the Rooney Rule, there were a couple of severe financial penalties. I think the Miami Dolphins were penalised $500,000 for transgressing this rule, although the use of financial sanctions has arguably diminished as the rule has gone over time. But the rule, by and large, has been cited as a key mechanism through which the representation of racialized minority coaches has been increased and sustained over time in the US. Now, perhaps the most substantive positive action interventions of this kind in professional football in England, and this was the focus of my research over the past few years, was and is the English Football League's codes of coach recruitment. Again, referring back to sort of the legal definition of positive action, these codes constitute a form of positive action in their attempts to better enable the participation of underrepresented groups in a given activity or workplace, and are specifically described as such by the English Football League. So the EFL on the right, they refer to these codes as positive action forms. Now, these codes were initially introduced at 72 club youth academies. Now, that was the mandatory code. The voluntary code refers just to the first team level of professional football. And these were introduced in 2017 and 2018 respectively. Now, it's important to note that these are relevant just in the English Football League. So these are the 72 teams that play in the second, third and fourth tiers of the English game. A scheme such as this doesn't take place at the, this specific scheme, didn't take place in the Premier League. It was just the 3 leagues below that, the 3 professional leagues below. There is a similar scheme that the FA have introduced called the Football Leadership Diversity Code that does take place across all 4 professional football leagues, but that is slightly different to this one, and this is what my research is focused on, so I'm going to focus on this for the time being. For more insight into these actions, you can see some of the research that myself and my colleague, Dr. Stephen Bradbury, have undertaken over the past few years. We've had some publications on these 2 schemes, these codes of recruitment. But just very broadly speaking, the mandatory code of coach recruitment stipulates that youth academies should run a full recruitment process and advertise publicly for all coaching positions and ensure that at least one suitably qualified racialized minority candidate is shortlisted for interview. There's also stipulations about the amount of time that vacancies are advertised for and where vacancies are advertised to ensure there's a public and full advertisement of processes. In contrast, the much less tightly worded voluntary code, as you can sort of assume by the fact it's called a voluntary code as opposed to mandatory code, it advocates, so it calls for rather than mandates, similar sentiments of inclusive shortlisting for head coach positions at the first team level of professional clubs. But as hinted at, it also features a series of operational caveats and opt-out clauses for clubs choosing not to adhere to this positive action measure in recruitment. So this voluntary code is something that professional football clubs at the first team level were encouraged to do as opposed to mandated to do. So key difference there. How effective have these actions been? As I said, research suggests for softer positive action measures, these have been shown to have some success in relation to supporting racialized minority coaches to sort of upskill their vocational capacities and experiential learning, and in doing so, heighten their employability within the football coaching marketplace. But really, the extent to which these measures, as I said, have changed something fundamental about recruitment and employment in professional football remains debatable and questionable. On the right-hand side, harder positive action measures, specifically such as the EFL's mandatory and voluntary codes of recruitment based on the US Rooney Rule, have been shown to have had mixed success. So our research suggested that the mandatory code, specifically at the youth academy level, did enable the participation of racialized minority coaches in club recruitment processes. It enhanced the participation. Our research suggested that from the scheme's introduction, we analysed really the first season of the scheme's introduction. The vast majority of racialized minority coaches that applied for roles were given an interview, and this is in youth academies, I must make that point clear, and about half of all those interviewees secured employment positions. So relatively positive figures there at the youth academy level. My next bullet point says these are quite isolated increases. I don't know if you remember my point from earlier about where racialized minority coaches are more likely to be found. Again, my research suggested that as a result of the mandatory code, it was more likely that racialized minority coaches were to be offered employment in part-time and less senior positions. That's an important point of nuance that needs to be made. At the first team level, there were negligible impacts. So the codes weren't really adhered to. There were several media stories about clubs not following this. Regrettably, the media arguably has placed less attention on this in a couple of years. bar the important work such as the Sports People think tank and more recently the Black Footballers Partnership, who have placed a spotlight on this and have generated sort of helpful media headlines around these issues, which obviously continue to plague the sport. So operationally, the actual practical implementation of these measures, there were some small isolated successes at the youth academy level, less so at the first team level. But as our research has really made the point, we can't just examine how these measures work in practice. We also must examine the attitudes, ideologies, and philosophies of those implementing these measures. That really is key to understand how these measures take place, how they play out, and it's a good predictor of how effective they might be if we know what people who implement them think about not only positive action, but what their attitudes are more broadly to equality, diversity, and inclusion. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit on the next slide. So these are just what I'm going to present here, just some quotes that came from our research when we asked club academy managers and professional club CEOs about their opinions towards positive action and to issues around diversity, equality, and inclusion more broadly. And there were quite strong linkages between what decision makers thought about equality, diversity, inclusion, and whether they supported or did not support the principles of positive action and the implementation of it in their club or youth academy. So on the left-hand side, we had an admittedly smaller cohort of key decision makers who were more likely to see that there was a problem in the sport in terms of how coaches are recruited. These, as we termed it, these decision makers were more race conscious. They were more likely to see race as opposed to ignore it and be blind to its impacts. An example here from Academy manager who thought we do need a bespoke option because if we keep doing what we're doing in terms of current recruitment, the number's not going to improve. These decision makers were more likely to value cultural diversity. So again, decision makers here more likely to believe in role models. They could see maybe a different relationship between young black players and black coaches, or young Asian players and Asian coaches. That was something they noticed. So they saw the value of cultural diversity for the benefit of their players, not just coaches. And as I said, due to these sort of perspectives, these race conscious individuals were more likely to buy into the principles of positive action and implement these codes of recruitment more meaningfully. As we can see here, this was an example quote from this academy manager at the bottom there. They really felt there's got to be a fairness to recruitment, and these positive action measures were more likely to enhance that fairness. On the right-hand side, unfortunately, a far higher proportion of decision makers, academy managers, and club CEOs were more likely to be race neutral in their approaches to these measures, to the mandatory and voluntary codes of recruitment, and to issues of equality, diversity, inclusion more broadly. So these decision makers were less likely to see racialized barriers in the game. They didn't really think they existed. They thought if people were proactive and just went out and got the coaching badges, then recruitment would follow. Arguably, that does take place for white coaches often, but for racialized minority coaches, that happens much less often. So there was sort of a universalization, of the experiences of white coaches to try and say that all coaches experience this. But as the figures suggest, that doesn't take place. Again, as opposed to those decision makers who valued cultural diversity, these decision makers on the right were more likely to be race neutral. They didn't think diversity was important. If anything, they thought diversity detracted from the competitiveness and the performance and the ability of their club to be as successful as possible. So diversity was sort of seen as antithetical to a successful club, which in a modern multicultural sport, arguably is something that is quite concerning and does need addressing. Again, for the right-hand side, these race neutral decision makers, there was more of a limited organizational buy-in. There was less emphasis on this being something positive. It was something they sort of took or left. It wasn't really important. It was an afterthought. It wasn't something that they needed. really, was their overall opinion about this. So really what our research suggested here and hinted at is the importance of seeing race and avoiding colourblind approaches to recruitment and equality, because this will only reproduce the racialised status quo, as our figures suggested. And really the findings from our research here indicate that interventions are more likely to be operationalised in practice where organisational actors, decision makers such as academy managers or CEOs, exhibit race-conscious philosophies and rationales, and therefore exhibit stronger conceptual buy-in to the intended aims and objectives of positive action. That's crucial. So concluding thoughts really, as I just wrap up, I think I've got a few minutes left. Measures to address racialized inequities in elite level football coaching need to be strongly interventionist, so they can't just do something, change something about the coaches. They have to fundamentally change the way that the sport operates in terms of recruitment and employment. And they must be transformational in the focus and scope, and they should utilize, as we argue, contextually proportionate positive action measures to achieve these aims. However, as part of this, much stronger consideration needs to be paid to examining the ways in which the attitudes and ideologies of key decision makers in clubs inform their opposition or support for positive action interventions. As I'll argue on the next slide for my recommendations, we must pay attention to the attitudes and ideologies of decision makers. If we ignore that and just drop in an initiative in a club without knowing what people think about these issues, they will highly, research suggests it's more likely they won't engage with it properly. That might not consciously be someone who is against ideals of equality, diversity, and inclusion. They might just not be informed properly about the reasons for that measure, or they might not have been explained in sufficient detail why this measure is significant. But we must pay attention to those ideologies and know the landscape that these measures are taking place in. Otherwise, we're going in blind, so to speak, which doesn't work. And again, key point here, attitudes, philosophies, and rationales are crucial in informing the extent and ways in which measures are contested and resisted, or endorsed and operationalized at an institution level. So we must examine attitudes, philosophies, and rationales. We can't just look at how a policy works. We have to look at the attitudes behind it, take a more holistic approach. Now, just briefly for the last minute or so, some recommendations that have emerged from our research that we have traditionally split into operational recommendations and attitudinal recommendations. And as I said, positive action measures designed to address the underrepresentation of racialized minority coaches should include and be part of a holistic set of actions. So more operationally, to ensure a uniform implementation of positive action measures in terms of recruitment and employment. Clubs could be provided standardized guidance documents and a checklist of best practice regarding the best practice of advertising for roles, how to receive and respond to job applications from all coaches, not just racialized minority coaches, how to conduct interviews, and how to implement a interview guarantee for racialized minority coaches, and what should be considered when appointing coaches as well. And to support this, culturally diverse interview panels and a provision of detailed feedback to enable racialized minority coaches to better prepare for future applications. Often feedback is missing in this. So coaches who are missing out on roles, which are more often racialized minority coaches, maybe don't know what could improve their application next time. But as I said, attitudinal recommendations are key as well within this. So we need to consider the education of key stakeholders with responsibility for the recruitment and promotion of coaching staff at professional football clubs and youth academies. These activities should encourage key stakeholders to critically reflect on their understandings of the racial equality and diversity landscape in football coaching, and really seek to shift the thinking from race neutral to more race conscious perspectives. In doing so, these activities should really heighten the awareness of the existence, types, and impacts of racialized barriers in football coaching, and how race neutral approaches to coach recruitment have only tended to sustain rather than address patterns of racialized disadvantage over time. And really, again, key point here, educational activities and related considerations should be underscored by a strongly social justice orientated rationale. Really, that has to be the driving force to this. There's a social justice rationale to addressing long-standing inequities in the way that racialized minority coaches are treated or provided opportunities for employment in the game. And yeah, this is the only Portuguese I guess I'll speak, but obrigado, sorry if I pronounced that badly. That's me done. Happy to take any questions, and thanks everyone for your time this afternoon or this morning in Brazil.
Thank you, Dom. Obrigado você. Your Portuguese was perfect.
Thank you.
Thanks for being very kind and generous.
I'm just replacing Claudio. He had to go to, he's coming back, but I'm replacing him. It's always a great pleasure and to hear you and learn from you. Okay, the questions and will be done afterwards. Okay, and I will introduce now. And the questions will be done in the follow-up after the presentations from Delroy and Marcelo.
No problem.
Okay. Our next speaker is Delroy Corinaldi. He's a co-founder and chief executive of the Black Footballers Partnership in the UK. Good morning, Delroy. Good afternoon for you. Thank you. And the floor is yours.
Good morning, Dom. Good morning, Donald, for the introduction. And good morning to everyone who's found the time to join us today to discuss what is a very important subject. I'd love to say it's a subject which has only reared its head, come about in the last 6 months, or even 6 years, but it's been a subject that's been resonating for many, many decades now. And it resonates not only in Brazil, not only in England, where I will be basing most of my discussion, but also, sadly, across the world. When we started on this work, and now I will share a screen, when we started this work as it come up, when we started as Black Footballers Partnership, this work, the data at the time we looked at from a company called Smarter Scout was that out of 1,000 coaches across Europe, only 30 were Black coaches. And I say Black because that's the focus of our work. So what I will do in my presentation is very briefly talk about who I am, very briefly, then give you an outline of BFP and what our objectives are as an organization, and then a few visuals about who's involved, our target audience, and then of course, Donald, you will help me with the 2 presentations which points to the data that underpins our work. And at the end of that, those presentations, I'll then take 2 moments to say why that work is important and how we are using it to try and change government policy. So, who am I? So I'm Delroy Corinaldi. I hope you can see this screen clearly. I was one of 3 people that co-found Black Footballers Partnership. I co-founded it with former footballer Michael Johnson, male footballer Michael Johnson, and a former female footballer, Eartha Pond. My background is not in football. I have played at a junior level, at a youth level, and semi-professionally, but I am not a professional footballer. My expertise is around strategy, around communications, and around change. And I've used those skills to, hopefully you can see it on the screen, to work with footballers to create a fully functioning organization, which is 3 years old today, this month, which has 3 objectives. One is to look at the representation of Black footballers across all tiers of the game. 2, to consider the education of footballers at all levels to ensure clubs are providing the necessary support. And the third element, which is of particular interest to me, is around the community impact, using football as a platform for change. Key to all of this is work we've undertaken recently, which is how do we support future generations? And you will see throughout my deck, we're often talking about former footballers, maybe even current footballers, but none of this matters unless the future generation coming through can see hope and opportunity for themselves. The young man you see there is a wonderful young man called Juriah Boateng. He won a recent writing competition with the Premier League, and he's an academy player at Brighton Hove Albion Football Club, which is also in the Premier League. And we sponsored his launch with a law firm. So none of the work we are doing today, for me, matters unless we help the future generation coming through. So who's involved in this organization as we move towards the data? We are a men and women's football organization. We give support and a voice to Black footballers. Some of them you will see in the photo, some of them you will know in the photo. Many of them have played from the most junior levels right up to the Premier League, even winning and picking up the trophy in the Premier League. So from a BFP point of view, who are our stakeholders? Who matters to the work we're trying to do to give voice and support to Black footballers? All stakeholders, to be honest. I think a lot of initiatives that happen in this area is very much directed at football. And as I said at the very beginning, and as both Donald and Dom have demonstrated, over the years, if you leave football to do what football has always done, football will never change. So in looking at some of the challenges, I think you have to bring in other actors who may see the inequities in football as a reason for them to get involved. And why football? Well, these issues, they are existent in accounting profession, the legal profession, you name it. Any profession generally sees people that looks like me as not worthy in some cases of the opportunity to grow. But football is different in terms of analyzing the problem. There is no other sector where the amount of data required to understand the problem to get you to the solution is actually available. Black people play sport on the pitch far greater than we are able to access any other profession. And their inability to access off the pitch roles, I think, can be better understood through the data, which we will come on to later. So our audiences are footballers, or one of our audiences, one of our complex audiences. And as you'll see, Ian Wright, who's a well-known footballer and now commentator and pundit, in his book, 2016, which is some 8 years ago, if my math serves me right, talks about how talented people, black people, are being ignored by the game. And if those who are talented are not getting an opportunity, what does that really say about the game? Another footballer you may all be familiar with, Emil Heskey, played for England, Liverpool, and Leicester. In his book, he talks about American sports, and Donald, you referenced some of the data in American sports. He was saying if in American sports, there are greater levels of black representation. Why is it that we're such a long way from meeting up to the American standard when the proportionate numbers of black players is around the same? Eniola Oloku, who's very prominent in the women's game, played for England, played for Chelsea, is also a well-known pundit. She talks about non-black players who have easily transitioned into management. And she talks about the racial stereotypes there, which allow certain people to get job after job, whereas others who look like us do not. And then, of course, there's the world-renowned international star John Barnes, who played for Liverpool as well as England. And he says, you know, you black players, and again, Dom kind of referred to this, you know, often end up as academy coaches and managers, but academy coaches, sorry, or at the bottom end of the what we call the football pyramid. And they're given jobs, but they're not real opportunities. They're not real careers in order to be a manager. And then they don't get the same amount of time to develop and win. They're quickly got rid of. And this will be shown statistically in the data that our professor, Stefan Szymański, did for us. So it's not a level playing field. These footballers have told us, and they're an important audience for us, if not the key one. But increasingly, we're starting to move into the political space because we need those levers to shape the game. And it's become of increasing importance because over here, as well as the voluntary initiatives that Dom spoke of, we've now got legislation that's passing through the UK Parliament, which allows us to influence what's going on there. And we've started doing some of that, and I'll reflect on that shortly. So we're in the UK Parliament. We're even engaging the Mayor of London, Sadiq Khan, and other politicians. We engage the UK media. So our profile for an organization which was, as I say, 3 years old, we're now positioned in the media as a fully functioning, reputable organization. We're throughout the UK media. I mean, we've been quite blessed to have the data and the people involved who have given us that profile. And you need that profile if you are to engage with the game that often shuts people that look like you and I out. Certainly people that look like you and I who have got data that goes against what they would like to discuss and how they would like to discuss it. But we're also engaging international media. So this is a
no caderno de esportes, na mídia internacional, principalmente a mídia americana é muito importante, por causa dos clubes todos.
90% of the clubs are owned by American investors or people. And now I've given you a sense of who we are, what we're trying to do, and how we're being positioned. Nothing of what we're doing would have the same resonance without the academic rigor
sem o rigor acadêmico de três acadêmicos que nos ajudam aqui. O primeiro é um cavaleiro chamado Professor Stefan, e ele gentilmente narrou duas dos quatro relatórios em que ele está envolvido. Eu gostaria que vocês vissem aqui as dificuldades todas que nós estamos realmente atravessando. Assim, com que, na verdade, parece que estamos fazendo muitas coisas, mas os resultados, no final das contas, não são tão expressivos assim.
Okay, I think you have to stop sharing your slides. So I can stop
believe
your presentation. Okay.
Thank you.
Let's see here.
Vamos aqui ver.
Make sure I start with the right one.
Yeah, it's 2023.
2023, the first
Yeah.
one?
Yes, please. It's not very long.
This is the one?
Yes.
Just hold on.
No problem.
I think, could you hear?
No. I
No?
started off being able to hear it, and then it disappeared.
Okay, let's try. Let's start again. Share screen. Share sound. That's it, right?
Yes. It's the first one.
Hello, everyone. My name is Stefan.
Could you hear the sound?
Yes, very clearly.
Yes.
Yes.
Deu para ouvir aí, Joyce? Okay, let's do it.
Hello, everyone. My name is Stefan Szymański, and I'm a professor of sport management at the University of Michigan. I was commissioned to write a report by the Black Footballers Partnership last year, and this is a follow-up to that report.
Now the sound.
Last October, the FA's Football Leadership Diversity Code report stated that there were signs of progress and that many clubs were exceeding expectations. However, insofar as this reflects hires of black people, there has been no significant progress, as the table on the right from the FA's report demonstrates quite clearly. Not only are many clubs failing to meet expectations, but there are many clubs that do not subscribe to the code or are just not supplying any data. The data that we have compiled is taken from the a publicly visible website, Transfermarkt, which lists the performance and details of many individual players, but also management positions within football clubs, including not just senior management, but also coaching staff at all levels, scouts, employees in the medical department, and so on. That point can be emphasized using data on new hires in the previous 12 months, again comparing the initial report in 2021 to the new report in 2023. The blue bars show different levels of reporting in each period, and the black bars show that there has been no significant change and very low representation overall. So what can we conclude from the data? The first thing is that in the last year, there has been no sign of progress. The voluntary code is not working. The second point I think we should make is that young players need to be offered a pathway through the system. It's clear that the failings occur from the point where players are moving into retirement. This is when they need to be offered the opportunity to move into the management system, and that is one crucial area where the system is failing.
Donald?
Yes.
Can you go to the second slide for me, and then I will speak to that before we go.
Okay.
You don't need to put it on. You don't need to do the voice. Just second slide of, not this one.
The second slide.
Second slide, yes, please.
This
Just
one.
click on it. Yeah, no need to put the. Yeah, no need to do the voice. Oh, it's there. You can pause on the voice if you wish.
The main findings of the.
Yes.
All right. Can you see it from
Okay.
there? Okay.
I can. The reason I've gone back to this slide is because it kind of underpins the injustice for black footballers in English football, if people can see it. The green part of the graph tells you the number of black players or black people at various levels, and the black part of the graph are non-black players. So in the English Premier League, when we did this work in 2022, 43% of the players were black, so 43 in every 100 were black. And yet, of the roles that went to former players, only 4 in every 100 roles went to black players. In other words, 4%. And that is, on its own, I'd have to say quite a disgraceful figure, but it's worse when you think they're often told they don't have the qualifications and the badges. But as you can see from this chart, 14% have got the highest qualification, which is the pro license, and 1 in 4 have got other badges, the UEFA license badges, etc. So I think this chart, as well as all the work we've referred to previously, points to that challenge we have around racial equality in football. But the other points that Stefan made in this slide is also very important. And it again refers back to what Dom was saying. There have been many initiatives done by football to address this gap, racial inequality gap or inequity gap. And often the players will tell you before these initiatives have had a day or a month to roll out that they will not work. And it's not because they don't want them to work, it's because they have the lived experience to know whether they will work. Dom's, as I say, work points to some of this. So in the last 2-3 years, the FA produced, which is the governing body, Football Association, produced a football leadership diversity code, which is a voluntary code. And they said it would work effectively. And in fact, after 1 year, 2 years, they said it was exceeding expectations, that the code was exceeding expectations. And when we did the work with our academics, we found that not to be the case, and it was indeed not meeting expectations. In fact, it was failing. So the challenge we have is we need the game to move forward in order to deliver the change. But if the game itself is not producing data that can be trusted, then how are we to move forward? So what we did is we commissioned more research, which would look at 3 elements of the football chain for men: access to the pitch, promotion whilst in a job, and whether black players were more likely to be fired when they were in a job, irrespective of performance. And that's the next bit of research I will now ask Donald to click on in order for you to see what the academics concluded.
Hello, my name is Stefan Szymański, and I'm a professor of sport management.
Could you hear, Don?
We could hear that. Yes,
Yeah, you could hear? Okay.
Yes.
Okay. We'll start again.
Thank you.
Hello, my name is Stefan Szymański, and I'm a professor of sport management at the University of Michigan.
It stopped. I don't know why.
Should we give it another go?
Okay.
And I co-authored this paper with Thomas Peters.
Oh.
1 minute, 1 minute. Let's.
Technology, Donald. Technology.
Yeah. Okay. 1 minute. Let's try it again. Why it's going through the.
Hello, my name is Stefan Szymański, and I'm a professor of sport management at the University of Michigan. And I co-authored this paper with Thomas Peters from Erasmus University and Sam Hoey at the University of Liverpool. This paper follows up on 2 previous research papers published by the Black Footballers Partnership, which identified the extent of discrimination in the market for football managers in England. In this paper, we seek to identify the bottlenecks and blockages which help to produce these outcomes that we observe in the labour market. It is a basic fact of football that the vast majority of managers are former professional players. The striking feature of English football and football in other countries is that while a large fraction of professional players are black, the proportion of managers that are black is much smaller. To demonstrate this, we have collected a sample of former professional players and sought to highlight the progress of those former players into football management if they progressed into football management at all.
I think I skipped, huh?
Don't worry, if it gets too complicated, we can talk through it.
Let's go to this third slide.
Okay.
In this paper, we identify 3 bottlenecks that exist in the labour market which affect black professional footballers wanting to pursue a career in management. The first of these takes place at the entry level. We looked at the factors which influenced the entry of former players into management based on their characteristics, the position they played on the field, their success as a player, and so on. And what we found was that being a black player made you significantly less likely to enter the managerial labour market regardless of your ability or other characteristics. In other words, there appears to be a bias against hiring former black players right from the beginning of the management process. This covered not only the highest job in management, obviously the manager or head coach himself or herself, but actually any junior job such as youth coach, assistant manager, and so on. The second bottleneck we considered was the process of promotion from entry level to higher levels of management, right up to the manager position itself. What we found was that black players who enter management are significantly less likely to get promoted to a higher level than non-black former players who enter management. What this chart shows along the vertical axis is the current position of the former player, and along the horizontal axis the next job that they enter. And the figures in this table illustrate the difference between the probability for a non-black player of getting promoted to a former black player. What's noticeable is that former black players are significantly less likely to be promoted to assistant manager, and significantly less likely to be promoted to manager from any junior job that exists. And they're also significantly less likely to find that their next job is a promotion from their previous job. The third bottleneck comes, if you will, at the end of the managerial career. What managers are regularly fired from their positions, both senior and junior managers, usually reflecting poor performance of the team. That's illustrated in this table by the impact that the number of points generated by the team managed in the previous 10 games and the cumulative surprise, that is the difference between what people expected the results to be compared to what they actually were, both negatively affected the survival probability of the manager. When the team is playing badly, you're more likely to get fired. When the results are surprisingly bad, you're more likely to get fired, which is what you would expect. However, even after allowing for this, you're significantly more likely to be fired if you're black. That suggests a third element of discrimination in the labour market. Having established these 3 sources of discrimination in the labour market, we can now visualize that in terms of the progress of former players into managerial jobs at any level or at the most senior level. What these two charts show is the difference in the average number of days in management jobs for former black players and for non-black players. And what's clear is that over time, both black players and non-black players are likely to spend more time in managerial jobs, reflecting the accumulation of experience, but that the number of days in management positions is significantly lower for former black players than it is for the non-black players. Thus, in any managerial job, which is the chart on the left, it appears about half as likely, or the average former black player is likely to spend about half as much time in any managerial job as the non-black players. And the chart on the right suggests that when it comes to managerial levels, the non-black players spend about 4 to 5 times as much time in management jobs compared to the former black players. These charts illustrate that same point, identifying the particular positions in which former players progress into management. Bearing in mind that the most former players do not end up in management, this shows that, roughly speaking, about 20% of former players who are not black end up in management positions, whereas that percentage for black players is between 10 and 15%. And these tables also illustrate the extent, the types of jobs which former players end up in, with the best jobs or the highest ranked jobs at the top and arguably the lowest ranked jobs near the bottom. And what's clear is that black players who enter management find it much harder to reach any of the top jobs, and particularly to reach the highest management level, even when they accumulate experience, compared to the non-black former players. So that it's harder to get in at the beginning, it's harder to make progress over time, and you're more likely to be fired at any point in your career. So this report has identified 3 key obstacles in the progression of black players to managerial positions: barriers in entering the managerial market, barriers to being promoted within the market, and barriers to further progression due to being fired from your job. Each of these biases could be addressed, but it would require a will to do so on the part of the football authorities.
Right. Thank you, Don. So I thought the academic would be in a better place to talk about his data, their data, than I would. And I think the data is quite striking, really. And, you know, if someone that doesn't look like you, 50% greater chance of getting a management job than you, even though you've got the qualifications and the experience, that's quite disheartening. If when you do get a job, you're less likely to be promoted than someone that looks not like you, that's quite disheartening. And if you're 41% more likely to be fired than someone that doesn't look like you, even though you've performed just as well and often better, then that's quite disheartening and points to what the academics themselves have said. It's hard to look past racial discrimination. And actually, I've not had to say it when I've done interviews. People that don't look like me, that are outside football, are beginning to say that themselves. So I say this to point to the initiatives, which we will hear, I'm sure, what's going on in Brazil, the initiatives Dom has talked about over here. There will be many initiatives, and they will sound great at the beginning, and they will have glossy documents, and the documents will look brilliant, and they will put someone that looks like you and me on the front cover, and they will get someone that looks like you and me to speak out. But the reality is, unless you understand the problem, really understand the problem, you're going to struggle to get a sustainable solution. So my last few points, I realize I don't want to overstay my welcome here, is to go back to my slide deck, is basically to say there's legislation going through Parliament at the moment. Oh, if I click, here we go. And it's called the Football Governance Bill. And it wasn't born out of how do we tighten up inclusion, equity, and diversity in football. It was born out of the creation of, or what could have been the creation of, a European Super League, which the government wanted to prevent. And that was a few years ago. You may remember the big clubs in Europe were looking to break away from the Premier League and other leagues. So the bill came out of that, but also they wanted to trickle down. So the money from the Premier League should go to the lower clubs so that they could remain fully functioning. So the bill was because of that. But I have to say, through the hard work of many, but in no short supply to Black Footballers Partnership, we've managed to get EDI as part of equity, diversity, inclusion as part of the government's bill, right? But a bill is not the same as an act of legislation. So there's a lot of work to be done as it processes, because there are many people and organizations that are resistant to that. But if you can see it on your screen, we are now in Parliament. We are making our case known, and we now have members of the House of Lords. And you need to understand our system to know how it works. We have members of Parliament, and we have who are elected, and members of the House of Lords who are not, but they're all part of the legislature. They're part of changing the law. And we had a member of the House of Lords using our briefing, our work in Parliament, to indicate why more needs to be done in this area. As he said, there's clearly something not right. This is from Lord Bassam. And we've had other members of the House of Lords, this gentleman, Lord Mann, who says there's a deficit in the number of Black players getting into better coaching and managerial jobs. That is clearly to the detriment of the natural game, and their talents not being used. So we are making the data relevant to various audiences to try and secure the relevant change and to make sure we have a voice and a seat at the table. So I say to you in my sign-off, the academic work is important. It's essential to moving forward. It is the basis of any work, I think, data. But unless that data comes off the shelf and is in the minds and the eyes of the decision makers, I fear we will be back here in a year's time and 5 years' time. So Black Footballers Partnership is about strategy, it's about data, and it's about securing change. And we've made some strides forward, but there are only 2 out of 92 professional managers in the Premier League that are Black. 2 out of 92. That is not a great position to be in, and we hope to push for change so that can change. Thank you very much for your time.
Errou. So, thank you very much, Delroy. Muito obrigado, Delroy,
Thank you very much, Delroy, for your right presentation, for the thoughts that you made us think about today and for the afternoon here. To the participants, I remember that the questions will be covered in session conclusions and reflections at the final stage of the event. Our next participant, Marcelo Carvalho, is the idealizer and executive director of the Observatory of Racial Discrimination in Football. Marcelo covered the topic, the black coach in Brazilian football. Marcelo, thank you very much for being with us this morning here in Brazil, afternoon in Europe. It's a great pleasure to meet you, and I give you the floor. Good morning and good afternoon to everybody who are listening to us. First and foremost, to thank Donald for the invitation, to thank for this important initiative to being happening. It's always important that initiatives such as this one happen so that we can indeed discuss racial discrimination in Brazilian football and understand how that is being discussed outside Brazil. My name is Marcelo Medeiros Caldeira. I am a black man of 51 years of age, passionate for football. Just like any black kid from the outskirts, I dreamed about being a footballer. I did not pursue a career, but passionate for football, I tried somehow into this world. I am graduated in business administration, MBA in business management, and 2014, I created the Observatory of Racial Discrimination in Football, a project that came with the objective of monitoring and following the cases of racism in Brazilian football. This project comes to life in May 2014. 2014 was the year that Brazil hosted the FIFA World Cup. In March and April this year, there were some cases of racism, some of them with Márcio Chagas, Rutinga and Aranha players, and Brazil discussed whether those cases of racism were anecdotal or if they happened frequently. And I went to investigate it. I went to investigate if there was data about racism in Brazilian football, especially reports of racism. They didn't find this information. And then I decided to create the observatory so that I could make this data collection. From 2014 on, we've monitored over 300 reports of racism in Brazilian football. It is important to highlight that those reports that we bring in our report, those are published by the Brazilian media or the international media. So we monitored in the first year 25 cases of racism in Brazilian football. Then we broadened that to the observatory monitors each and every form of prejudice and discrimination in Brazilian sports and with Brazilian athletes abroad. But from 2014 onwards, the curve has just grown. So we had 25 cases in 2014. The last year, we've monitored over 100 cases of racism. After the monitoring of the first year, we in contact with the FAIR Network, an English entity that works with discrimination in Europe. We have a conversation, some exchange, and we launched in 2015 our first yearly report of racial discrimination in Brazilian football. And that report brings the unfoldings of the case of racism. Because more than just talking about and reporting the case of racism, we needed to understand what happened to each case of racism in football. Brazil has a legislation that causes punish in case of racism in general. This provision was changed in 2023, making racism in racial slur as equivalent. So any racist attitude should lead a person to being arrested. Unfortunately, that does not happen in Brazil, least in football. So the observatory appears with this objective, trying to give voice to the athletes of football, try to make them denounce cases of racism they suffer, because in 2014 it caught really the eye when an athlete said that he was not going to report a case of racism, he suffered because the only person that was going to be harmed was he himself. Nothing is going to happen to the racist. So the observatory appears with this intention, but for the moment that we start to denounce racism, we are touching the tip of the iceberg, and we start realizing that the debate has to be broadened. And then in 2019, we did an action with the Fluminense and Bahia, both clubs that had black coaches at that moment of the Brazilian football. Bahia had Roger Machado as its coach, and Fluminense had Marcal. Both coaches really took up the colors of the observatory, and two coaches with the same jersey that caught the eye of the media, and the media went to check what that action was and what it meant. After the match, Roger Machado gives an interview, and his interview ends up broadening the work of the observatory, and that interview from Roger Machado ends up having repercussion in Brazil and the world. Amongst many other things that Roger Machado says, he says, my being here as a coach, a black man, shows that there is racism in Brazil. The fact that I am here, that I am the exception, that I am one of the few black coaches of the main series, the A series. That is not a proof that racism does not exist. It shows that might be an exception that the racism is present. And then Brazilian football starts discussing the non-presence or the absence of black people in the managerial powerful positions.
Curiosidades que eu sempre tive quando lançaram o observatório é tentar entender se de
understand what if Brazilian soccer, Brazilian football is actually a place with having major presence of black players. So we can notice that Brazil as an institution have utilized the photography of the Brazilian national team to say that there was no racism in Brazil. In 2014, with the debate that is born of the racism incidents that happened that year, we can understand in an assertive way with data that no, actually football is not a democratic space. It's not a democratic arena. We can see what the Black movement has always said, that Brazil doesn't have racial democracy. So and there's a curiosity. And the Brazilian football is actually a place of opportunities for Black people. This answer is given by the fact that we can see throughout the course of time how several players have inserted themselves in this space and have changed their financial lives. We can see that the dream of some boys and girls, and way back, it was to be a footballer, to ascend socially. So it's the same dream that the boys have and girls have nowadays. But we know that in Brazilian football, most of the managers and people in leading position are former players. You can say most players are black. Why don't we have black coaches in this arena? So we can state that this is due to racism. It's due to the people who are in the top tiers in position, in terms of positions, that they don't believe in the capacity of black people, in their intellectual capacity. So that black people have of managing a group. So that's why the Brazilian football doesn't provide enough room for coaches throughout history. We've had very few managers that attained some sort of success, that became champions. But these coaches, they rapidly leave the labor force. We had in Flamengo 2 coaches who were champion in Flamengo, but their career were very short. You have like white coaches with mediocre results that are still in the workforce. So we try to shed light on this to the Brazilian society, we can see the Brazilian society can start to discuss these racist events. So when we see, when we see if racism cases are frequent or not, we may go for another question: who to punish and how? Because when we see several cases where racism is verified, there is no punishment for the club and not for the offender. But we need to move forward. We need to talk about this absence of Black people in these positions. So in 2022, we seal a partnership with CBF, the Brazilian Confederation, and after 8 years, they acknowledged this work of our observatory, and we signed a partnership with CBF, and CBF is the main supporter of the observatory in providing, in helping us with our report. So from that, we start to discuss with CBF, the Brazilian Confederation of Football. We start to talk about the absence of Black people in leading positions. So in 2022, we've launched a project called Black Teachers. So in partnership with CBF and Vivo, a telephone company, they chose 10 Black men, and out of these 10, six of them won a scholarship to study at CBF. And today these professionals they're finishing their license A, like top license. So when we talk about this absence of such professionals, Black professionals, we hear that these people are not qualified enough. So these people haven't prepared themselves. So observatory, together with CBF, we're saying that we need to qualify, we need to provide qualification for these people so they can be ready for the workforce. So these 6 professionals, they are finishing license A, and they are becoming apt to actually coach teams in Brazil. So this has been the work of the observatory, and not only this project with CBF, we have been also doing other actions with other teams like Bahia, Corinthians, Vasco, with soccer teams, with football teams, to touch Brazilian society as to racial discrimination. Is to show also that all the testimonials of a racism that we see, or people say like a recreational racism, they're not a joke. They end up taking society to believe that Black people actually Black people may die. Okay, when you say that an influencer says that Mbappé, the French player, has all the characteristics to be a thief on the beaches of Rio de Janeiro, you're saying that any Black kid who can run fast can be a thief. And whenever you see a Black kid running on the beach in Rio de Janeiro, we might be entitled to arrest or kill this person. So the observatory has actually teaming up with CBF and some football clubs, not only to finish with racism, but utilize the strength, the power that football has, so that we can have a dialogue in all social arenas, social spheres. Because when we are going to discuss racism, in several opportunities that we have, most people that are there in these events, they are Black people. And we need to talk, actually, the people who need to hear that the most are actually to understand racism and think about solutions. It's white people, and the power football has actually is something that enables people to actually enter into a room where racism is being talked about. So this is the work of the observatory throughout these 10 years. This is what we have believed, that we have been mobilizing ourselves to do, and we have been having partnership with companies, federation, and other entities to be part of this work. After CBF, we had a partnership with CONMEBOL, the Latin American Confederation, also another partnership with the Nike, and also to answer this question that I had, the quantity of people, the number of people in sports. And then I believe that these are this quietness that sort of stirs us to map out the Brazilian scenario as in the soccer world. So there were forms sent to clubs where certain professionals wanted to answer 4 questions that we made about religion, race, so about the areas, the regions, and gender. And out of the professions from, we heard actually 508 people. We could map that also 41% of such professionals consider themselves Black, but most of these professionals are are actually on the pitch, on the field. So something that Donald said at the beginning of his presentation is without data, it's very difficult to actually discuss with these confederations, such entities, to actually get more Black people inside other areas. So when we have data, we empower ourselves. So Observatory has been mapping out what is being done in the United States. In England, there are two places where we can see there are like very interesting initiatives, and some of them have been presented here, how to insert Black people. But in Brazil, some people question the observatory. Would it be ideal to think about quotas for Black coaches? I'm against. I myself am against. We couldn't really have that debate in society, the importance of quotas in universities and the public spaces. I think quotas are very good for the Black community. It strengthened the country to become more diverse, and I'm highly favorable of that, but football is not really ready for such debate. So I believe when people ask me, I tell them that I'm not in favor of it, but because we have to have like a thorough debate in society about the quotas to show people how they are important and necessary in every arena, in every space, including football. So when we see Brazilian football, when we see how the clubs are managed, we can see that most football clubs in Brazil are managed by families that have been in power for a long time. So we can see that the current president of a club, he is the grandson or the nephew or the son of somebody who has been in this position already. So we see there are families that actually they take turns. So you can see actually for a long time that in soccer, in Brazilian football, we don't see an advertisement in a paper or at a human resource company talking about positions open for managers, for communication sector, for the media sector, for the legal sector. Why? Because these spaces ended up being political spaces. So usually the president is going to nominate somebody who provided some support for him during his campaign. So this president is going to nominate somebody else's son, somebody he knows. And usually the people who frequent such spaces many places are people who have studied in the same private schools and in places where the vast majority is white. So Brazilian football hasn't understood actually that it's a very excluding, very biased place. It's a place where that lacks diversity, lacks inclusion. And unfortunately, they utilize the fact that there are several Black players. There's to say that it's a place of diversity, to say that it's a place of possibilities for Black people. But what we have been talking about in the last years, that this is limited to the pitch, to the field. The fact that we have one Black coach is always the exception, that confirms the rule. So one of the coaches in the first league that we have is Roger Machado. Roger Machado is a coach who has been positioning himself throughout time. Before and after 2019, Roger has been very strong in his talks about the racism and social discrimination. But and that caused, and I think in this year or last year, a major club here in Brazil ventilated the possibility of contracting, of hiring Roger Machado. He said that one of the reasons, one of the possible names was Roger Machado. But that made like social media, many supporters from this club, but they're no, that supporters would say that Roger Machado wouldn't be the ideal coach because he was like a militant, he was an activist, he wasn't actually a football coach. So that is the fact that Roger Machado fights for a cause that everybody should fight for, made this supporter actually excludes the name of Roger Machado. Actually, Roger Machado is international, is a club from southern Brazil, has been talking a little less about racism, and it also backs the question, backs the affirmation. Also, like, why do Black people don't use their space to discuss racism in football? So then we have to understand that throughout history, Black people who have positioned, who have stated their opinion in Brazil, they ended up losing their opportunities. Doors were slammed shut, they were removed in one way or another. We can think about names as Aranha, who has positioned himself in 2014, and then he had to retire. We can think about Márcio Chagas, who was a referee who in 2014 he spoke his mind, and then his career was shortened. We think about Coach Gentil Cardoso there in the 50s, in 1950s. He was the only Black man to occupy the position of a coach for the Brazilian national team temporarily, but even so, he ended up losing space. We can talk about Everardo, forward from Atlético Mineiro, who would celebrate his goals with his fist, like like Black Panthers, Black Lives Matter sort of a gesture. And he was persecuted by the military. So you can talk about when Reinaldo clenches his fist, and then he becomes a substitute player. That this is like an advice, like this is a message actually for the Black people shouldn't really speak their minds, state their opinion. So now what we're seeing now is a change of paradigm. So Vinicius Jr. is one of the best players in the world who is using his voice to actually show all the racism he suffers. At the first moment, he received retaliations from the La Liga, the Spanish league, but then Vinicius Jr. had like ample support from the federal government, from CBF and other companies and entities and institutions. Vinicius Jr. continues to speak his mind, state his opinion. At first, La Liga, they said they cursed somebody as a monkey. It was like part of football antics, and now we see that there's actually now penalties and arrests of supporters who were racist against Vinicius Jr. So we can see that there's been a change. There's been a change in the Spanish legislation. So that's why it's so important to have that the players actually speak their minds. But the observatory has never really demanded Black people to actually speak their minds and state their opinions, because we know they're the weak link in the chain, and you know what may happen to them. So what we have tried is to have like a communication with the media. So we have always been instigating media, trying to show the media that they would talk about racism, going like beyond facts. the facts that people know. Going beyond the highlights. Not only in November, not only when it's Black People's Awareness Month. So Observatory has been provoking media to create, so that the press can talk and make new questions. In 2022, the then president of CBF, the first president to call himself as Black and from the Northeast, he said that one of his wills was like to change the general regulation in the Brazilian competitions and actually make teams lose points when there were racist events. What drew my attention in the end, at that moment, she wanted to hear the 20 presidents from the first league and the second league to try to understand if they would provide support to such initiative. Out of the 21 from the first league, only 6 presidents said they would be in favor of such change. Said that they would think about it, and the remainder said they were against. So that is that we can't really have a major change if the clubs don't really provide support to such changes. So we've been following here during the course of time a change in FIFA, like more severe penalties. Now, as the FIFA has created a gesture for the player to let the referee know that he's undergoing racism. So we know that the penalties have been raised from $30,000 to $100,000. So we've been seeing these institutions are trying to make a change when we talk about penalties, but the observatory understands that we will not finish racism in football if we only think about penalties. We need, it's pressing that we think about education and awareness. All right, we must think about including Black people in leading positions. And then we're talking about coaches, Black coaches. I forgot to say that this year we've launched together with CBF a program called Black Female Teachers. The first one was only contemplating men. Now this one aims at contemplating women. So now to provide the possibility of Black women to do the CBF courses so they are ready and qualified to coach teams in Brazil. So this is the work of our observatory, the vision that we've been trying to fulfill during these 10 years. And more than ever, we need that the clubs promote diversity. And the few clubs that did this in the last year was Bahia, who launched the program to include men and women, Black men and women in leading positions, administrative, but more than that, we need people, Black people, coaching or being an assistant coach. And I said that on a segment on television, said that Roger Machado near the pitch is much more than just a Black man there. It's actually the example and the inspiration, role model for other Black people to be there coaching. So we need those examples. So I will finish my time here a little before the time so that I could interact a little more with you about all the questions that have been brought to the table. Thank you very much for the invitation. And I would like to thank to have this idea here. That's what we need. We really need to talk that in such space, the absence of Black people in the command of football.
Muito obrigado, Marcelo, pela sua
Thank you
fala.
very much, Marcelo, for your words, for the thoughts you brought to us today. I would like to invite back to the table Professor Ari. We're closing the round table. I have the participation of Professors Donald, Dominic, Del Roy and now Marcelo. And in this last part, we open to the questions. If you have questions, please put them in the chat box of YouTube. And I have some here. And if you want to start, then we go to acting. And you can do the second. Okay, please go ahead, Claudio. Feel free to go. First question I have for Donald came from Cesar Madruga. He would like to know more about your research. I assume that it is a systematic review of the literature, that you present cases about the top level. It's not a systematic review, I believe it's the other one. You talk about the top level of the modality. And it says, have you thought about doing a comparison with other levels of football, not only the top tier, but the lower tiers of the Brazilian football?
Ok. Obrigado, Cláudio. Parabéns.
Thank you, Claudio. Congratulations. Roy, Marcelo, and Don, who I'm not sure, but he's not appearing here on the screen. But we'll start the debate here. It's very important having those interventions. And it's always a great learning. What I defend, this is an important question, Claudio, for the following aspect. I've commented here, and it was corroborated by Marcelo's presentation, the absence of data regarding the representativity and diversity of the Brazilian sports organizations. Delroy's presented several pieces of data. Professor Don, did it too. They've brought us a piece of information that you mentioned, that a person asked, if it is my intention, extend this research into the, say, the lower levels, the youth academies, as they call it there. What we need, what I defend is, what I've said initially, is that we need enormous data collection regarding the representation and diversity of these Brazilian sports organizations. We don't have data about that. I needed to create a commission of identification to obtain such data regarding the upper levels of football, Series A and Series D. And I'm going to give here Don and Elroy, that in Brazil, IBGE, the Brazilian Institute of Geography and Statistics, does ethnical racial census through self-declaration. So IBGE, the Royander, goes to the person here in Brazil and asks, what is your color and race? How do you identify yourself? And the person comes and says, oh, I'm white, black. The person is self-declaring his color or her color and race. And based on that self-declaration, the Brazilian Institute of Geography and Statistics published the data. And the last census said that around 56 to 57% of the Brazilian population is formed by black people. That is, when black and pardo, the brown, mixed people. Why not would the CBF and the Brazilian Olympic Committee that published several pieces of information, I will not say several pieces of information on the official website, name of the person's nickname, height of the person, why not get to the clubs and demand from the clubs in this file that I don't know, that there is also self-declaration. You understand? And then I wouldn't have, all the researchers wouldn't have to get the data. There would be some progress, enormous progress, compared to any other part of the world that doesn't have it. There are the courses by the Brazilian Football Coordination that Marcelo mentioned here. What is the ethnic racial representation of people that actually meet the licenses A, B, C, D, Pro from the federation? Do we know it? So to end, Claudio, yeah. It would be truly important to have that piece of data of the youth academies to know the representation of the players and the youth and the coaches there. It would be very important, but they send those data for all positions of leadership in organizations, and we have a limitation to make a great effort. So this for A and B series, I needed 24 judges. 12 judges analyzed over 1,000 players in HC, another 12 analyzing 1,000 players of the B series. It's an enormous effort. So it is in the radar as researchers to have the data, and from the data, and constantly obtaining data to propose and create measures.
Obrigado, Donald.
Thank you, Donald. Just checking if Ari would have any question there in his line. No, for me, no questions, Claudio. I myself would then have one, but I would like, I'd rather have the public. If you want, I want to explore the questions, and at the end I'll ask mine. Actually, I just wanted to, sorry, Claudio, to make use of this moment. I think that the moment we do have time for that. But I have to thank everybody there. Donald, we thank the Douglas, Marcelo, Dom, Delroy, you, Claudio, but also congratulate Donald, because this event is much of his personal initiative and effort. I think it's important that everyone should know this. And as for the questions, I then have, if there is no one else to ask a question, I have one. Thank you, Claudio. Okay, excellent, Ari. No doubt at the end we're gonna pay homage to the do homages. I have a question here from Gerson Lima to Delroy. Donald asked me to ask a question directly in English. I believe that it would facilitate communication. So if you allow me, you're gonna have the translation back into Portuguese.
I have a question for you. It's from Gerson Lima from Brazil, and he would like to know more about the data you presented. If those data are specifically for one part of the world, a specific continent or country, and if you have data from other parts and how important this is to promote.
Thank you very much for the question. So the data we crunched was for English football, right? Premier League, League Championship, League One, League Two, but we have the capacity to go beyond that. And you know, this is talking to Donald. This is part of our question as to how far we can go and what else we can do elsewhere. The American market actually has opened up in terms of what's happening in the MLS, Major League Soccer. They approached us, people in America have approached us around that data. But I think, look, I think it's very clear, sadly, that it doesn't matter what country you're in. When you look, have a certain look, irrespective of the experience, irrespective of the qualifications, you are sadly less likely to get on than to get on. And I think until we get to the heart of that with the data, we will end up talking about initiatives after initiatives, which buy those with the power 3 years, 4 years, 5 years. So I think the players, current players, need to recognize this, and I think they're struggling to do that because they're in changing rooms with a mixed group of people, the same mixed group of people that I would have grown up with. And their belief would be that we're all in it together, we're a team on the pitch, so of course we'll be a team off the pitch. And then the black player gets to, let's say, 35 years of age. And their hope at that point is they'll be treated the same as those players, black and white, on the pitch. And then it takes them probably another 5 years. I haven't done the analysis, we will be doing it. It takes them probably another 5 years to then recognize that the hope they had of being treated the same as their non-Black peers disappears. So the older generation of players, the former players, have come to realize that. The players who are in their 40s and have come to realize that. And those players who dream of this new world and everything's going to be fine, it's with sadness actually that it takes them a little while to realize the data doesn't lie. So the final point I will make is, and working with academics is brilliant, but working with the politicians who get it a bit more actually is important, because you need to understand strategy in order to change these things. These things have happened generation after generation, and sadly showing no signs of getting any better. So you have to be strategic if you are going to impact any change. And even then, we know what it's like in the wider world. It's not easy. So it's tiring, it's hard work. The goal is important, but we need to recognize football has shown itself not willing to change, irrespective of the data, which is very clear.
Thank you very much, Delroy. And I think you brought a very, very important point here, that if we can engage with more people in different stakeholders, that's the way, especially politicians. You're totally right. Maybe this is a challenge for Donald in the next seminar to bring some some politicians here to discuss with us. And so thank you. I have a question here for, desculpa, sorry, Delroy and Dom, I'm going to come back to Portuguese because I have a question to Marcelo. A minha próxima questão é para o Marcelo.
My next question goes to Marcelo from Glidis. And the question, Marcelo, is, what might be the strategies for the preparation of players or Black leaders in leadership positions in football?
Bom, essa pergunta ela é boa.
Well, this is a good question. It is interesting, but it has a previous step to that. Brazilian football prepares athletes and players. It does not prepare human beings. So we need to work with the football teams in their youth academies. So instead of just preparing labor, they should think about preparing citizens for the world. Oftentimes, when we think about a footballer, we imagine millionaires who make a lot of money. That's an exception in Brazilian football. Few are the players who get there. And that exception is also within a structure that out of 1,000 boys who try to play football, only 1 or 2 will actually become professionals. The other 998 will just stumble around during the way, and oftentimes without any preparation to get any other job, because they stopped studying, preparing themselves to be footballers. So what we need today is to have at the youth academies of those clubs, to have those kids go to school, and that after going to school and become professionals, that would have to think that they would need to go to a university. Roger Machado, that I mentioned before, he said that when he thought about becoming a football coach, the first thing he did was to go to a physical education university, because he needed to understand what happens to the body of an athlete in terms of physiology. Not there in just being in the field and watching it happen. He needed to understand the academic perspective. It ends up that he's an exception. Footballers with high education degree in Brazil is an exception. It's a lot different from other countries. So I believe that the preparation is there. And the previous level, it has to be considered at the youth academies.
Obrigado, Marcelo.
Thank you, Marcelo. That's totally true. And we go back to the first question we had. We tend to focus at high level, that's important, which is a mirror, but what you said is important. How many players start and do not make it and we forget them? So it's an excellent point. Just bring in Professor Furegato back here to discuss with us. Welcome back, Ivan. I'm just going to give a question to Donald because he has a question for Don, and we continue here on the debate.
Primeiramente, firstly,
First,
I'd like to make a point. I totally agree with Delroy about the strategy, and without the strategy and the politicians, we will not reach any place we deserve and want to. Yeah, and the data is necessary amongst this strategy. Now, Dom, your latest article or paper was on youth academy, and this was one of the questions the audience asked me about the research on youth academy, if I intended to extend what I've done to the elite football. I want you to comment a little on the importance of doing this research on the youth academy and how talk a little more about it.
Yeah. So youth academy football, I guess, hasn't always been the focus of attention for the work I described in my presentation. But it's important area of focus for several reasons, I'd say. Firstly, it's extremely diverse in terms of the players in youth academies these days. A large proportion of racialized minority players play in youth academies. And in terms of coaching, it is often the place where, unless you're maybe a mega star name or you've had a successful career with a team and you get chucked in straight away to coach or manage that team, youth academies is often the place where coaches might learn their trade, so to speak. It might be a place where a lot of coaches begin their coaching journey in maybe academies of teams they used to play for, or different academies, because the focus is more developmental in youth academies. They're still very competitive environments because it's a place where young players are effectively in competition with each other to play at the first team and to make it as a professional footballer. But in terms of coaching, it is more of a, I'd argue, from my experience, not that I played in an academy, but it's more holistic than the first team environment, in the sense that first team coaching is about results, whereas youth academy coaching is often, we want to win and develop these players, but it's also develop players as people as well. So youth academy for coaching could be a really fruitful area to look at, because certainly in the UK context, it's more diverse at the coaching level in youth academies, our data suggests, than it is at the first team. Perhaps because there is less risk associated with youth academy level compared to the first team level. So some of the research suggested that racialized minority coaches at the first team level are associated as more risky propositions because they don't have the experience, because these stereotypes that still abound around these groups. So CEOs and chairmen will be less likely to appoint them, whereas that element of risk and that element of jeopardy that's still perceived archaically around racialized minority coaches is less prevalent at the youth academy level, I'd argue, as well. So a very fruitful area to look at. One thing that we've identified a bit in our research is that perhaps a reason that related to that there is a higher likelihood of racialized minority coaches at youth academy than there is first team, is that because the playing population is so diverse in youth academies, and youth academies want those young diverse players to have role models, to have people who they can look up to and connect to, that seems to create a bit of a pathway for coaching for racialized minority coaches, because they are valued for their sort of relationships they can develop with racialized minority players. Almost like that's a very important, academy managers says this, that they value racialized minority coaches because they create these bonds and these relationships with young racialized minority players. Now, that could be a positive in some sense, because I'd argue if you've got such a mixed playing population, you don't want an all-white coaching team. You want some cultural connectivity. It's important that people, as we've mentioned throughout this seminar, you see people who look like you, behave like you, speak like you, perhaps more relatable, more of a comfortable environment. But on the other hand, arguably, if academies are only conceptualizing racialized minority coaches in these spaces as valuable to players and valuable to meeting the organizational aims and objectives of the academy, then we're still racializing these people, these coaches. They're not being viewed as coaches because they're great coaches. They're being viewed as, oh, let's get these coaches in because that'll help our players feel more at home and more comfortable. And that might be a part of the reason why these coaches, racialized minority coaches, are more likely to be found at developmental roles, work with younger age groups where they're seen as more impressionable and where young players might benefit more from a role model. So that might be why there's a more likely prevalence of racialized minority coaches at the lower level. Sorry, I've forgotten the question a little bit, but what the point being is youth academies, yeah, very important because they are really important sites in the coaching journeys of a lot of established coaches. And there's different dynamics at youth academies that take place at the first team level as well. And understanding what goes on at youth academies can help in some sense to explain what goes on at the first team level. So I don't know what the youth academy structure is like in Brazil personally, but in the English game, yeah, that's where we're at with these things.
Thank you, Dom, for your answer. Yeah,
Claudio, can I come in a bit? Claudio.
Of course. I saw that you raised your hand. Go ahead, Roy.
Yeah. So I talk to a lot of our members are, in the football system, and I get messages from young coaches who are talking to me about racism in the system at academy level. So far, I've not been able to do much with it for a variety of reasons, but I get messages, even yesterday, from academy coaches. I think one of the problems is they don't have anyone to talk to because the hierarchy in clubs doesn't look like, like me, I guess. And they don't trust the people in the system. But I don't know for sure until we do the work, right? Just giving you a hypothesis. And secondly, Black people get seen as to be like social workers, the carers, like care workers, right? Who go into a system and it's a very important job, cleaning bottoms and cleaning the floor in hospitals and care homes. So this is why I think the data is very important. The data produced by Stefan and the rest, and I'm sure Dom's data points to this as well, is you don't get a job, first of all, compared to your non-Black players. And then when you get a job, you don't get promoted. So you get stuck in the academy system for a while. If you're a good boy, right? That massa thing may be there. And then when you do get a job, you're more likely to get fired than your white counterparts, 41% according to our data, right? So I think we've got to understand that, yes, it's nice to get a job because young coaches in particular, are desperate to get a job and they want to prove themselves, but the data tells you they don't then progress, right? And the progression and the importance around the progression is this. In basketball, they call it an X's and O's coach. And the point we face is we're not seen as technically good enough. We don't know numbers well enough. We don't know tactics well enough. We don't know X, we don't know Y. And I think that is born out of, unfortunately, again, we need to do the work here, around the stereotype that how could they ever run our team? Where I do have a slight variance with Dom is, and talking to owners now, which I'm able to do, and I'll be seeing one on Saturday, is owners actually employ sporting directors now, increasingly, to take football decisions, and technical directors to take footballing decisions, because I think the CEOs recognize it's an investment on their part, but it's not necessarily the pitch isn't their area and the coaching staff. So actually the the big area in the Premier League now are those people who are doing the recruitment within the clubs, and it points to some of the things Dom said around networks and so on. But we can't escape the stereotype, right? Sadly, you cannot escape it, particularly when you look at the data. So yeah, we will celebrate when people get jobs. We will celebrate when someone that looks like myself and others are aligned with the FA and are doing lovely initiatives with the FA around, kicking out racism and so on. And you can't say no to it, because who are we to say no to it? But the reality is these organizations and many of these people have been in roles for a number of years and nothing's changed. So if you really want to drive that change, you've got to therefore look at the problem differently, look who's engaged in the problem differently. Remember, and for those of you who don't remember, in the English Football Association, it was only a short while ago, I think it's 3-4 years ago, that the FA chairman, the person that ran the game, lost his job because he said coloureds, not black people, coloureds just want to kick the ball in the net, and that Southeast Asians just want to be IT people. The idea that it's just one person holding those views is laughable. So, these things are ingrained, and therefore we have to look at why it's ingrained as well as the structural issues. Sorry to jump in, but I thought it was important to make those points.
Thank you, Delroy. Tem uma pergunta aqui da Vera Lúcia, né? Ela não direciona para ninguém, mas
she doesn't direct that to anybody, but I think it could be to Don, to Douglas, to Marcelo. So what should the Brazilian government do as to public policies to accelerate equality in the football arena?
Quer responder, Donald?
Equanimity in the football. I can answer that. I can comment. I believe that Delroy put very well, talked about the importance of the different publics, the stakeholders, the importance of the stakeholders to get like measures and actions that could fight racism. So what studies have shown, and what I have been following, this measure should be holistic, in the sense that we need to have like measures on the macro level. So in the macro level, so the politicians and the government should be involved in this. There should be measures in the middle tier, so to speak. In the macro, it can include the FIFA and the Brazilian Confederation of Football. And you said that they have, the CBF have been doing, they have been promoting penalties. But when you talk to the structural and systemic racism, this is one of the causes of the underrepresentation of Black people exercising leadership positions in FIFA and CONMEBOL and FIFA and CBF. As far as I know, correct me if I'm wrong, they haven't done anything. So the Brazilian government should delve into the societal measures, come to the debate, and propose actually actions and follow up on them. So the actions by themselves, and Don and Douglas, so that they didn't have the desire to fight it. So the mid-tier and bottom tier also, micro measures also. So from all levels, and one club, one team, one organization is not enough. It has to be something more holistic, and the media also has a major role, because the media reinforces stereotypes and make them natural. So we need to bring the media to the debate.
Obrigado, Donald.
Thank you, Donald. And actually, and if we were to discuss the role of the media, we would have another event, a very interesting one. Claudio. There's an excellent point, how, as we had talked before, to bring the politicians, the media, and other stakeholders, the process is really fundamental. And Donald was trying to do that in his doctorate thesis, and we'll have more data towards the end of next year. So now I'm going to give the floor back to Ivan. to finish here with us. So good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Professor Claudio, Professor Ari. Thank you all. Just one final message here, reminding you that in the chat we had the attendance form here of the attendance form here. So the people who haven't signed, please fill it out. So in the next days, the organization here will be sending you the certificate through email and to prove your attendance. So they're here to finalize, to wrap it up here. I thank everybody who have been here, who followed here our event, or in the afternoon and evening in England. And I thank the lecturers, the moderators, everybody, and also thank here to our partners in the events, Abel Sports, Abragesp, and the support from Oz's production and ECAPS for financing this event. So I thank you all, reminding you that everybody in this panel are at your disposal. So this debate doesn't finish here. We have a lot to debate here. So I think we will meet again soon. And thank you all. Good afternoon, good evening, and maybe even good night. Okay. Thank you for being here until next.